Welcome to Midnight Murmurs, your gateway to soothing mysteries and chilling whispers. I'm here to help you unwind and explore captivating tales that lurk in the shadows. Remember to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing where and when you're listening. Now, relax and let the night embrace you. I still remember the moment I first saw Hollow Glen. After years of pounding city streets and endless concrete corridors, Claire and I, Detective Marcus Lockwood and my ever-optimistic partner, Claire Simmons, had traded the relentless urban chaos for what we hoped would be a sanctuary. The drive out of the city had felt like a slow exhale, a promise of reprieve from the constant din of sirens and heated disputes. Yet as the landscape gradually transformed from sterile asphalt to winding country roads bordered by gnarled trees and misty fields, I couldn't shake the nagging sensation that the very air held secrets of its own. The house emerged into view like a relic from a forgotten era, an imposing colonial structure with peeling white paint, darkened by decades of weather and neglect, its tall windows staring blankly out at the world. I parked our battered sedan at the gravel drive, and for a moment, silence reigned, a silence so profound it seemed to press in on me from every direction. As Claire hopped out with an excited spark in her eyes, I hesitated at the threshold, the weight of unseen eyes and memories I could not name settling in my gut. Stepping up the creaking wooden steps, I took in every detail. The heavy oak door bore faint carvings, intricate and almost hypnotic, as if they held stories of generations long past. My hand hesitated on the brass knob before I pushed it open, half expecting the sound of soft, persistent tapping to greet me. Inside, the foyer was dimly lit by the weak autumn sunlight filtering through stained glass windows, casting long, slanting shadows that danced in eerie patterns on the floor. "Isn't it marvelous?" Claire whispered, her voice buoyant with anticipation. She ran her fingers along the rough walls as though they were canvases ready for rebirth. "Just imagine the renovations we can do, restore the original charm, bring it back to life." But her optimism clashed with a dark undercurrent that I could feel pulsing beneath every worn floorboard. Our first exploration of the house led us down a narrow corridor where the air was cooler and the scent of aged wood and hidden decay was undeniable. In one of the many cramped rooms, we discovered a small, secret chamber tucked behind an ornate bookshelf. The room was filled with relics, dusty trunks, moth-eaten drapes, and a strange portrait that dominated one wall. The portrait, a meticulously painted likeness of a stern-faced woman, seemed to follow our every move with eyes that held both sorrow and forewarning. I stood transfixed, my skin prickling as if tiny hands were tracing cold patterns along my spine. As we continued through the labyrinthine hallways of the house, subtle yet unexplainable sensations grew stronger. A soft rhythmic tapping echoed from somewhere deep within the walls, a steady, persistent beat that felt both deliberate and foreboding. At first, I dismissed it as the natural settling of old wood. But as the tapping continued through quiet moments and even when the wind was still, I began to wonder if something else was at work. We soon encountered the first of our neighbors. Mrs. Harper, a frail elderly woman with eyes that darted about as if she were perpetually scanning for danger, greeted us on our doorstep. Her voice, brittle yet laden with unspoken grief, murmured warnings of previous tenants who had fled under mysterious circumstances. "Not all houses are meant for the living," she said softly, as if the secret behind her words was too terrifying to utter plainly. Other locals, too, exchanged polite yet cryptic greetings. Each whispered remark, each sideways glance, left me with the sense that the residents of Hollow Glen carried burdens too heavy for daylight. That very night, I lay in our sparse, creaking bedroom trying to sleep, but sleep would not come. The rhythmic tapping, now accompanied by the soft rustle of unseen movement, made my heart pound erratically. Every shadow in the room felt alive. I kept glancing at the antique mirror hanging above the mantel, a relic I'd noticed earlier, its glass marred by hairline cracks that scattered my reflection into broken pieces. At first, I attributed the distortions to mere imperfections in the glass. Yet as I watched, the fractured images began to move independently, as if they carried a life of their own, a silent chorus of fragmented memories whispering secrets I was not meant to hear. I remember the moment I first saw something in that mirror that was not my reflection at all. In a fleeting second, as the clock ticked past midnight, a shape, a shadow that did not belong to me, flickered across the cracked surface. My breath caught. I leaned in closer, my eyes straining in the dim light, but the figure dissolved into the murk of the glass as if it were never there. A cold sweat broke out along my back, and I pulled the covers tight, willing the terror to fade with the coming dawn. In the early hours of the morning, before Clara woke, I wandered through the house in a half-dream state, my senses heightened by the lingering dread of the night. I found myself drawn to the quiet corners of the vast hallways, where the air felt thick with unspoken histories. The floorboards creaked underfoot, each step echoing like a solemn beat in a long-forgotten dirge. My hand brushed against the rough texture of the walls as if seeking comfort in their unyielding presence. Every so often, I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow flitting just beyond the corner of my vision, only to find emptiness when I turned. Despite my growing unease, Claire was determined to breathe new life into our surroundings. Over a cup of strong, bitter coffee in the cramped kitchen, she excitedly outlined plans for renovations. "Marcus, think about it, restoring the old woodwork, uncovering hidden details, it's like reviving a piece of history. We can transform this place into something truly unique." Her words, filled with hope and practicality, clashed with the silent horror that I felt seep into every crevice of the house. I nodded absently, the clink of my spoon against the mug the only sound in the room, as my thoughts wandered back to that unsettling portrait and the persistent, inexplicable tapping that seemed to follow me from room to room. That day, as we began our methodical exploration of every nook and cranny of our new home, I couldn't help but notice how the very structure of the house seemed to shift around us. Hidden rooms revealed themselves in unexpected ways, behind a false panel in the parlor, beneath a heavy drape in the study, and each discovery was accompanied by a growing sense of dread. I felt as if I were trespassing on secrets meant to remain buried. The more we uncovered, the more it seemed that the house was alive with memories of past tragedies and untold stories of despair. I found a narrow staircase leading down to the basement, a place that smelled of damp earth and long-forgotten regrets. As I descended, the tapping sound grew louder, a rhythmic pulse that beat in time with my own quickened heartbeat. The dim light from the single, swinging bulb above cast elongated shadows that writhed along the rough stone walls. I paused midway, transfixed by the sight of a strange, inexplicable phenomenon. For a brief moment, I saw the shadow of a man moving in tandem with my own, though no one else was there. My breath hitched as I whispered, "Hello," into the oppressive darkness. The silence that followed was as heavy as a shroud. Emerging back into the upper floors, I sought refuge in what had become my sanctuary and prison, the bedroom. It was there, in the stillness of dawn, that I returned to the antique mirror. I stood before it, studying the fractured reflections that made me question every fiber of my being. Each crack in the mirror's surface seemed to pulse with a life of its own, distorting not only my image but also the very essence of the room around me. In the fractured glass, I saw fleeting images of the past, a woman's tearful eyes, a dark corridor filled with whispering voices, and a pair of hollow figures standing silently at the edge of perception. I could not tell if these were remnants of a collective memory or hallucinations born from my own inner turmoil. In that fragile moment, I wondered if the house was reflecting back at me my own hidden sins, those guilt-laden memories I had long tried to forget. The more I stared, the more the mirror seemed to beckon, its distorted faces contorting into expressions of agony and despair. I felt an inexplicable pull, as though the mirror was an oracle destined to reveal truths I was not ready to face. And then, as if in response to my silent plea, the mirror's surface shimmered, and I could swear that one of the images, a dark, indistinct figure, seemed to wink at me before vanishing into nothingness. The day wore on in a haze of half-formed plans and unspoken anxieties. Claire, ever the practical one, organized her ideas for remodeling the house, chatting animatedly about knocking down walls and installing modern fixtures. She was oblivious to the dark undercurrent that tainted the air. Her laughter, bright and unburdened, contrasted sharply with the oppressive heaviness I felt with every step I took through the corridors. I found myself retreating into quiet corners, my mind churning with questions I dared not voice. What was it about this place that stirred such latent terror in me? Had the house always harbored such secrets, or had they been awakened by our arrival? Late that afternoon, as rain began to tap lightly on the window panes, a sound eerily reminiscent of the constant, persistent tapping I'd been hearing, I decided to venture into the overgrown garden behind the house. The garden was wild and unkempt, a chaotic tangle of briars and unpruned hedges that whispered of neglect and long-lost care. In the soft drizzle, the muted colors of nature seemed to blur, as though reality itself was melting into a watercolor of uncertainty. I paused by a crumbling stone wall, feeling the cool, damp surface under my fingertips, and wondered if perhaps the house had chosen me, if it had been waiting, patiently, for someone to awaken its dormant memories. As the day gave way to a twilight that shrouded the world in deep blues and grays, I retreated back inside, seeking solace in routine. Yet, even in the mundane act of making dinner, an undercurrent of dread tugged at my thoughts. Every flicker of the candlelight, every creak of the ancient floorboards, spoke of a presence unseen, a silent witness to our intrusion into a realm that straddled the border between the living and the dead. That night, as Claire prepared to retire after a long day of planning, I found myself alone in the bedroom once more. The antique mirror hung above the dresser, its fractured surface a stark reminder of the uncanny distortions that had plagued me since our arrival. I sat on the edge of the bed, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The rhythmic tapping had returned, now more insistent and resonant, echoing softly through the room like the measured beat of a cursed drum. Every so often, I thought I caught a glimpse of movement in the periphery, a fleeting shadow that slipped past the corner of my eye, vanishing into the darkness as quickly as it appeared. I reached out, almost as if compelled by some unseen force, to touch the mirror's cold surface. The glass was startlingly cold beneath my fingertips, and as I ran my hand along one of the fine cracks, a shiver coursed through me, a chill that went beyond the simple drop in temperature. In that moment, the reflection in the mirror shifted. It wasn't just my face that stared back, it was a composite of countless broken images, flickering between my present self and a myriad of spectral visions that hinted at past lives and unresolved tragedies. The eyes in the mirror, my own yet altered somehow, seemed to plead with me, urging me to confront the darkness that lay hidden within both the house and myself. A sudden noise from the hallway made me jump. Footsteps, deliberate, measured steps, echoed down the corridor. My heart hammered in my chest as I forced myself to stand, eyes locked on the mirror. I strained to see beyond the distortions, to catch a glimpse of whoever, or whatever, was intruding upon my sanctuary. But when I stepped into the hall, there was nothing there. Only silence and the faint, maddening tapping persisted, a reminder that the house itself might be alive with memories too terrible to name. I returned to the room, my pulse still racing, and sank back onto the bed, haunted by the images burned into my mind. Claire's muffled snores from the next room offered no comfort. In that fragile solitude, I questioned whether I was merely exhausted from our move or if something more sinister was at work, a hidden force that had awakened with our arrival, intent on unspooling the secrets of Hollow Glen one piece at a time. As midnight deepened, the tapping grew louder, merging with the rustle of the wind outside and the occasional creak of the ancient house settling into its nocturnal rhythm. I lay awake in the darkness, every nerve alight with the awareness of being watched, every shadow a potential threat. My thoughts swirled with images of the portrait's sorrowful eyes, the hidden rooms that whispered of forgotten tragedies, and the mirror that fragmented my reflection into a mosaic of despair. In that oppressive darkness, the line between reality and nightmare blurred, leaving me to wonder if my own mind was betraying me or if the house was indeed trying to communicate something beyond my comprehension. Just as I began to drift into a troubled sleep, a final, unmistakable sound echoed in the room, a soft, deliberate knock, as though someone were tapping on the glass of the mirror itself. My eyes snapped open, and I stared into the fractured depths of the antique mirror. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was that persistent, rhythmic tapping, a cadence that seemed to pulse in time with my racing heart. And then, amidst the distorted images, I saw it clearly, a shape, dark and undefined, moving slowly across the surface as if it were drawn by an unseen hand. I sat frozen, my breath catching in my throat, as the shadow paused, its form wavering between the realms of reflection and reality. In that charged instant, the silence around me broke, replaced by a low murmur, a sound that might have been the whisper of a long-dead soul or the rustle of the wind through ancient trees. I couldn't be sure. All I knew was that whatever had stirred within that mirror had just made its presence known, and with it came a promise of secrets yet to be unveiled. My mind raced with questions I dared not voice aloud. Who was the shadow? What message lay hidden behind those fractured reflections? And most disturbingly, was I, too, becoming a part of the house's dark history, a reluctant keeper of its untold sins? As the clock struck 1, I realized with a sinking certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. The mirror, the tapping, the spectral shadow, all of it spoke of a mystery far deeper and more disturbing than I had ever imagined. In that lingering moment of terror and anticipation, I knew that my journey into the heart of Hollow Glen had only just begun. And as the final tendrils of sleep receded into a restless wakefulness, I could not shake the feeling that the house, with all its hidden rooms and unspoken histories, was silently waiting for me to unravel its darkest secrets. And somewhere in the depths of that fractured glass, the shadow lingered, an omen, a silent promise, or perhaps a warning that the true horror of Hollow Glen was yet to be revealed. The first night after our arrival in Hollow Glen, sleep eluded me entirely. I had scarcely closed my eyes when a nightmare of unspeakable clarity seized me, vivid, relentless, and disturbingly intimate. In my dream, shadowy figures emerged from the depths of a murky corridor, their eyes glinting with silent accusation. They whispered my name in a chorus of broken voices, each syllable laden with guilt and regret. I could almost feel the icy grip of their hands pulling at the edges of my sanity. The dream was so real that I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding as if it were trying to escape my ribcage. For hours afterward, the echoes of that dream reverberated in my mind, merging with the persistent sound of tapping that had haunted me since the day we moved in. Even when I was awake, the house conspired to blur the line between dream and reality. Late at night, while the rest of the world slumbered, I would hear the soft rustling of unseen movement, a barely perceptible scrape of footsteps along the hall, the gentle clatter of objects moving on their own accord. It started as isolated incidents, a book slightly ajar on a shelf, a window left open in a room I distinctly remembered closing. But soon, the phenomena grew more insistent. A sudden cold draft would slither through the corridors, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, as though the very air were infused with memories of forgotten decay. During one such night, as I lay in bed with the eerie cadence of the tapping echoing in the background, I felt compelled to rise and investigate. Each step along the darkened hallway was punctuated by my rapid heartbeat and the sound of my own labored breathing. I reached the living room, where moonlight filtered through stained glass windows, and paused before one of them. For a split second, my eyes caught something etched upon the glass, a series of symbols, swirling and shifting, like a message written in a language not meant for mortal eyes. I blinked hard, and the markings vanished as if they had never existed, leaving me questioning whether my mind was playing tricks on me or if something truly supernatural was at work. The next morning, over a breakfast of lukewarm coffee and sparse conversation, Claire tried once again to reassure me. "Marcus, you're overworked," she said with her usual blend of optimism and pragmatism. "All of this stress is playing tricks on your mind. We've just moved here, and the old house is bound to have its quirks." Her words, meant to soothe, only deepened my internal struggle. I wanted to believe her, but every inexplicable occurrence, every creak in the floorboards, every whispered echo in the dead of night, reminded me that something in Hollow Glen was far from ordinary. Determined to unearth the roots of these disturbances, I resolved to delve into the local history. I spent hours combing through dusty archives at the town library, poring over brittle newspapers and faded records that chronicled decades of whispered rumors and inexplicable tragedies. I discovered that Hollow Glen had long been a magnet for the inexplicable, tales of hauntings, mysterious disappearances, and a succession of owners whose lives had unraveled in inexplicable ways. The deeper I dug, the more I felt as if I were retracing the steps of those who had vanished into the mists of time, each one ensnared by a darkness that refused to let go. Among the many accounts of eerie occurrences, one name kept resurfacing: Eleanor Blackwood. Her story was shrouded in both tragedy and enigma, a woman whose own descent into paranoia and madness had been documented meticulously in personal journals, the details of which hinted at encounters with forces beyond the natural world. The more I read, the more I saw parallels between her experiences and the inexplicable events that plagued me. I began to wonder if our arrival had somehow reawakened an ancient specter of guilt and despair that had long lain dormant within these walls. One particularly dismal afternoon, while the rain drummed steadily against the library's leaded windows, I encountered Mrs. Harper once more. The elderly neighbor, with her frail frame and eyes that seemed to have witnessed more sorrow than most could bear, approached me with a measured caution. "Marcus," she began in a voice that trembled with both urgency and sorrow, "I've seen many come and go in Hollow Glen. Some speak of the past as if it were a living thing, clinging to every stone and shadow. You'd be wise to leave this place before it claims you as it has others." Her warning, delivered in a hushed tone as if not to disturb the very spirits that lurked nearby, sent a shiver coursing down my spine. I managed only a curt nod in reply, though her words haunted me long after she had shuffled away into the drizzle. That evening, as a dense fog rolled in from the distant hills, I found myself restless once again. The atmosphere outside was thick with anticipation, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and an undercurrent of decay. I stood by one of the fogged-up windows, watching as the swirling mist obscured the familiar outlines of the town. It was then that I noticed it, faint, almost imperceptible symbols appearing on the glass, their shapes fluid and mysterious. They shimmered briefly in the dim light before dissolving into the condensation, as if the very act of observation forced them to vanish. I pressed my palm against the cold surface, as if trying to imprint the fleeting images onto my skin, but the moment was gone, leaving only the lingering taste of dread. The nocturnal disturbances continued to escalate. As the clock neared midnight on several successive nights, I experienced an overwhelming sensation of being trapped between two worlds. In the dead silence of the night, I would awaken to the sound of footsteps pacing in an empty hallway, or the soft murmur of a voice whispering my name from a room that should have been vacant. On one occasion, I even caught a glimpse of a figure in the mirror, a dark, blurred silhouette that vanished the instant I turned to look. It was as though the house itself were a living, breathing entity, capable of manifesting the tortured echoes of its past residents. My internal struggle deepened. Each incident felt like a silent indictment of my own hidden guilt, a guilt I had long buried beneath layers of professional duty and self-denial. Memories of past mistakes and failures began to surface unbidden, merging with the spectral images that danced in the corners of my vision. I found myself questioning not only the nature of the disturbances but also the darker recesses of my own soul. Was it possible that the sinister energy that pervaded Hollow Glen was feeding off my own buried transgressions? Could the nightmares, the cold drafts, the inexplicable footsteps, be reflections of a past I had long tried to escape? Despite my mounting terror, I attempted to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Claire, ever the voice of reason, continued to dismiss my concerns as the byproduct of stress and exhaustion. "Marcus, you're just tired," she would say with a gentle smile that belied her own mounting unease. "We're in an old house, of course there are strange sounds and creaks. It's history speaking." Her attempts to ground me in rationality were earnest, yet as the nights grew colder and the paranormal occurrences more frequent, even she could no longer ignore the persistent, unexplainable events that haunted our every step. One particular night, as a violent storm raged outside and the wind howled like a chorus of tormented souls, the disturbances reached a fever pitch. I was startled awake by a sudden, bone-chilling gust of wind that slammed the window shut with a force that rattled the entire room. In the ensuing silence, the persistent tapping resumed with renewed intensity, echoing through the corridors as if driven by an unseen, relentless force. The house seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, each beat a reminder of the long-hidden sins it had silently collected over the years. Unable to bear the oppressive weight of that night any longer, I resolved to confront the history of this accursed place head-on. With a notebook in hand and a determination born of equal parts dread and defiance, I revisited the library the following morning. I meticulously combed through records of old town meetings, obituaries, and local legends, piecing together a mosaic of eerie coincidences and unexplained tragedies. Each story, each newspaper clipping, hinted at a pattern, a tapestry woven from the threads of loss, despair, and supernatural retribution. In one faded article, I learned of a series of mysterious disappearances dating back nearly a century, where entire families had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only cryptic symbols scrawled on doorframes and walls. In another, I read of a reclusive artist whose final, fevered paintings depicted grotesque figures and nightmarish landscapes, images that bore an uncanny resemblance to the hallucinations I was now experiencing. The more I uncovered, the more I began to see Hollow Glen not as a mere building, but as a repository for forgotten grief and unutterable horrors. By the time I returned to the house that afternoon, a pall of dread had settled over me like a shroud. I moved through the rooms with a heavy heart and a mind teeming with questions. Every creak, every whisper of whine through the ancient window panes, felt charged with significance. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, that its walls held secrets that were desperate to be heard. Later that evening, as twilight bled into the indigo of night, I sat by one of the fogged windows once again, this time with a sense of resigned determination. The symbols had returned, more distinct this time, drawn with a precision that suggested deliberate intent rather than random condensation. I traced my fingers over the glass, following the swirling lines that seemed to form a message meant for me alone. The chill that shot through my hand was almost physical, a reminder that some forces were beyond the realm of mere imagination. My introspection was abruptly interrupted by the sound of a soft knock at the door, a gentle, insistent rap that startled me from my reverie. I opened the door to find Mrs. Harper, her eyes wide and her face etched with worry. "Marcus," she said in a trembling whisper, "you must listen to me. The past here is not done with you. It clings to every stone, every shadow. Please, you need to leave before it consumes you entirely." Her words, laden with a sorrow that transcended mere fear, struck me with an almost physical blow. I wanted to protest, to insist that I was here to uncover the truth, but the urgency in her voice left no room for argument. That night, after Mrs. Harper's warning echoed in my mind, the atmosphere in the house grew even more oppressive. The nightmares returned with a vengeance. I dreamt again of the shadowy figures, this time more vivid than ever. They circled me in a dimly lit room, their whispers merging into a single, accusatory chant that dredged up every hidden regret and mistake I had ever made. In my dream, one figure, more defined than the rest, stepped forward and whispered, "You cannot hide from your past, Marcus." The words seared themselves into my consciousness, leaving a burning imprint that I could neither ignore nor forget. Waking up in a cold sweat, I realized that the boundary between my waking life and the realm of nightmares was dissolving. The spectral images, the persistent cold drafts, the inexplicable movements of objects, even the cryptic symbols on the windows, were no longer confined to the realm of dreams. They had invaded my reality, taunting me with hints of a hidden history that was desperate to resurface. In the following days, as I continued my solitary investigation, I found that the house itself seemed to conspire to reveal more of its secrets. Objects that I distinctly remembered placing in one spot would inexplicably appear elsewhere. Doors would creak open on their own, revealing long-forgotten rooms filled with relics of a bygone era. And always, in the periphery of my vision, I could sense a presence, a silent observer whose gaze seemed to follow my every move. Claire, despite her unwavering optimism, couldn't help but notice the deepening shadows in my eyes and the way I flinched at even the slightest sound. "Marcus," she said one morning, her tone gentle yet laced with concern, "maybe you should consider taking a break from all this. It might help to step back and get some rest." But I couldn't. How could I, when every new discovery only deepened the mystery and my own internal torment? The more I learned about Hollow Glen's haunted past, the more I felt that I was not just a visitor, but an integral part of a dark, unfolding story that had been waiting for me all along. That night, as a thick fog rolled in and blanketed the town in an otherworldly glow, I once again found myself by the window, tracing the delicate symbols that had become my constant, unwelcome companions. In the silence of that eerie moment, I couldn't help but wonder, were these apparitions and whispered warnings simply manifestations of my own guilt and stress, or was there a far more sinister force at work, one that had been waiting for the right moment to reawaken and reclaim what was once lost? As the minutes stretched into hours, the oppressive stillness was broken only by the steady, almost hypnotic tapping that echoed through the walls. Each tap resonated with an unspoken promise of revelations yet to come, a promise that the past would not remain buried forever, and that its echoes would soon demand their due. I sat there, suspended between fear and determination, knowing that the coming days would force me to confront not only the spectral remnants of Hollow Glen's history but also the darker truths hidden within my own soul. And as the night deepened and the symbols faded with the dawn, I could not shake the chilling certainty that the house was calling me deeper into its embrace, a call from the echoes of the past that would soon lead me into the heart of a mystery far more terrifying than I had ever imagined. In the days that followed those sleepless nights filled with uncanny sounds and cryptic warnings, a restless obsession began to take root in my mind. The house, this ancient, enigmatic structure, had already bared more secrets than I cared to imagine, and yet I sensed that the depths of its mysteries were far from exhausted. I found myself retracing my steps through dim corridors and musty rooms, searching for any trace of a history that could explain the unsettling events. It was on one of these solitary expeditions that fate, or perhaps some unseen hand, led me to a discovery that would both unnerve and enthrall me. While exploring the far corner of the study, a room lined with tall, dusty bookshelves and filled with the faded smell of old paper, I noticed a peculiar inconsistency in one of the mahogany panels. A slight gap, almost imperceptible at first, beckoned my curiosity. My pulse quickened as I gently pressed along the wood, feeling for a seam or a secret latch. After several tense moments of searching, a section of the panel shifted with a quiet click, revealing a hidden compartment behind it. Nestled inside, wrapped in a piece of faded velvet, was a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was worn smooth by time, embossed with delicate filigree that hinted at both elegance and sorrow. I held the journal reverently, as though it were a relic imbued with the very essence of the house's troubled past. There was a chill to its touch, a subtle, almost imperceptible vibration, as if it pulsed with the energy of memories long suppressed. Taking it to my study desk, I settled into the dim light of an aging lamp and carefully unlatched the brittle binding. The pages, yellowed with age, were filled with meticulous handwriting that seemed to dance between desperation and clarity. The entries belonged to Eleanor Blackwood, a name that had surfaced repeatedly during my earlier research into the local lore. Her words unfolded like a confession, chronicling a slow descent into paranoia, dread, and a form of supernatural terror that resonated eerily with my own experiences. She wrote of nights punctuated by inexplicable tapping and corridors haunted by shifting shadows. With each entry, her tone grew more frenzied, and the descriptions of her encounters became increasingly surreal, apparitions that whispered in languages half forgotten, cold drafts that carried the scent of decay, and reflections in mirrors that morphed into tormenting specters. As I turned each fragile page, I was struck by the parallels between her accounts and the phenomena I had begun to endure. There were uncanny similarities: the antique mirror in our bedroom, the persistent tapping that had never ceased, and the inexplicable chill that clung to the very walls of Hollow Glen. Eleanor's words were laced with regret and a deep-seated fear of the unknown, a fear that seemed to mirror my own internal struggles with guilt and the sins of my past. The journal was not merely a chronicle of supernatural events, it was a window into a tortured soul whose final days had been consumed by the same darkness that now encroached upon my every step. In the quiet hours of that evening, as I pored over her frantic scrawl, a heavy silence fell upon the room. I could almost hear Eleanor's voice, soft and tremulous, echoing in the stillness, a lament for a life lost to overwhelming terror. Yet, amid the sorrow and madness of her entries, there was a thread of defiance. She had tried, against all odds, to confront the malevolent force that seemed to prey upon those burdened by guilt. Her last, jagged lines hinted at a desperate plan, a final ritual meant to break the cycle of despair. But something had gone terribly wrong. The journal ended abruptly, leaving a gaping void where Eleanor's fate should have been sealed. As days bled into nights, I became increasingly absorbed by the journal's contents. My once steady routine of methodical investigation began to crumble under the weight of an all-consuming obsession. I spent hours in isolation, tracing Eleanor's final steps through the words she had left behind. With each passing day, I found myself withdrawing further from Claire, whose bright, pragmatic demeanor had begun to falter in the face of my growing preoccupation. I noticed the worry in her eyes as she observed my late-night vigils by the desk, the way she would quietly ask if I was getting enough rest or if I needed to step away for a while. But the more I read, the more I felt that I was on the verge of uncovering a truth that transcended personal torment, one that was woven into the very fabric of Hollow Glen. One moonless night, compelled by a force I could neither rationalize nor resist, I left the safety of our home. The journal clutched in my hand was my sole companion as I made my way to the overgrown cemetery at the edge of town, a place whispered about in local lore and laden with the weight of unspoken tragedies. The cemetery was shrouded in a dense mist, the gravestones emerging as ghostly sentinels from the gloom. My heart pounded as I searched for Eleanor's grave, guided by the faded inscription on a stone that trembled with age. Finally, I knelt before it, feeling the damp earth cool against my hands as I placed the journal gently on the weathered stone. For a long, heavy moment, the world fell silent. I could almost sense another presence there, watching, an unseen witness to my silent plea for answers. In that lonely, hallowed ground, a profound sadness mingled with an eerie comfort, as if Eleanor herself had reached out through time to share her burden. Returning to the house that night, I felt an intangible shift, a subtle yet palpable change in the atmosphere. The corridors seemed narrower, the shadows deeper, as though my intrusion into Eleanor's legacy had awakened something within these walls. Over the following days, I began to see her presence in the periphery of my vision. A fleeting silhouette in a mirror, a hint of a figure at the edge of a doorway, or the sensation of soft footsteps echoing just behind me. At first, I dismissed these as hallucinations born of exhaustion and guilt. But as the encounters grew more frequent and defined, I could no longer ignore the unsettling possibility that Eleanor's ghost was indeed manifesting within the house, a spectral echo of a life marred by terror and regret. Her apparition was never fully seen, never given form beyond the briefest moments of recognition. Once, as I passed the long hallway adjacent to the study, I caught a glimpse of a woman standing silently by the window, a figure in a pale, flowing dress, her eyes sorrowful and yet brimming with unspoken warning. When I turned, the space was empty, save for the faint outline where she had stood. Each of these encounters left me questioning the boundaries between memory and apparition, between the supernatural and the manifestation of my own haunted mind. Claire grew increasingly concerned about my fixation. I noticed the way she would pause outside my study door, her hand hovering uncertainly as if she wanted to knock but feared disturbing me. During one quiet afternoon, as I sat silently absorbed in Eleanor's anguished words, she finally spoke. "Marcus, you're not yourself lately," she said softly, her eyes reflecting both worry and a hint of desperation. "This journal, it's consuming you. I know you're trying to find answers, but at what cost?" Her words, laced with genuine concern, momentarily broke through the haze of my obsession. I wanted to assure her that I was in control, that these were merely the remnants of a haunted past resurrected on paper. But how could I explain that the very ink of Eleanor's despair resonated with the hidden guilt I had long tried to bury? For nights on end, I found myself restless and alone, the journal a constant companion that drew me further into a labyrinth of memories and spectral warnings. I began to document my own experiences, scribbling frantic notes and sketches alongside Eleanor's entries, trying desperately to capture the overlapping layers of my own reality and the ghostly echoes that now haunted my every step. Each entry was a confession, a melding of past misdeeds and the relentless pressure of a malevolent force that seemed to thrive on my internal torment. Yet, even as my mind teetered on the brink of obsession, I sensed that Eleanor's journal was more than just a chronicle of terror. It was a map, a guide to confronting the very heart of the darkness that had long pervaded Hollow Glen. In the final, desperate scribbles, she hinted at a secret that lay hidden beneath the surface of the house, a ritual, a sacrifice, or perhaps a final act of defiance against the curse that bound her to this wretched place. The details were tantalizingly vague, yet they stirred a dangerous hope within me, the possibility that her fate, and perhaps my own salvation, depended on uncovering that long-forgotten truth. But with each revelation, the line between the past and the present blurred further. The spectral encounters grew more vivid, and I began to question whether Eleanor's ghost was a benevolent guide or a harbinger of doom. Late one particularly oppressive evening, as the rain hammered relentlessly against the window panes and the persistent tapping echoed through the halls, I found myself once again drawn to the study. There, in the half-light, the journal lay open on my desk, its pages fluttering as if stirred by an unseen breeze. In that charged moment, the air grew heavy, and I felt, as though time had momentarily stilled, a presence behind me. Slowly, I turned, half expecting to confront the ghost of Eleanor, and for a heartbeat, I saw a figure hovering in the doorway. It was too indistinct to be called human, a blur of sorrow and silent warning that dissolved as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me with a lingering sense of profound isolation. Now, with every passing moment, the journal seemed to tether me ever more tightly to the house and its tragic legacy. I could no longer discern if the spectral manifestations were merely the product of my fraying sanity or if they were indeed the living remnants of a soul tormented by guilt and despair. The lines between Eleanor's suffering and my own internal demons converged, each feeding off the other in a symbiotic dance of sorrow and foreboding. As I sat there, pen in hand, trying to capture the ineffable terror that now defined my every waking moment, I couldn't help but wonder if I was destined to repeat the fate of those who had come before me. Was I simply another lost soul, drawn inexorably into a web of darkness spun by secrets too terrible to face? The question haunted me as persistently as the ghostly apparitions that flickered at the edge of my vision. In that suffocating stillness, as the candle burned low and the final words of Eleanor's desperate entries echoed in my mind, I realized with a dawning horror that the true mystery of Hollow Glen was only beginning to reveal itself. And with that realization, a chill that went beyond the mere drop in temperature crept up my spine, an unspoken promise that the journey into the heart of this malevolent past was far from over. The oppressive weight of Hollow Glen pressed in around me, night after night, as if the very walls were conspiring to reveal the secrets they'd harbored for so long. I'd thought that discovering Eleanor Blackwood's journal would offer some measure of clarity, or at least a map to the mysteries hidden within these ancient rooms. Instead, it seemed to have opened a door to a darker realm, where the past and present merged into a cacophony of murmurs and half-remembered sins. Now, as dusk bled into night and the old house creaked in anticipation, I could hear it, faint, sibilant whispers that slithered through the darkness, calling out my hidden transgressions. I lay in bed, the stale cool air of the room mingling with a persistent tapping that seemed to echo the rhythm of my own anxious heartbeat. At first, I tried to dismiss the sounds as the natural groans of an old building, but soon they evolved into something far more sinister, a murmur of voices, layered and indistinct, yet insistent enough to demand attention. Each whispered phrase, barely audible above the rhythmic tapping, seemed to unravel a secret I'd long tried to bury. Liar, unworthy, betrayer, they hissed, as if dredging up every misstep, every guilt-laden mistake that I had fought so desperately to forget. I couldn't shake the feeling that these voices were not mere echoes of the wind or the settling of wood. They were personal, addressed to me, indicting me for sins I had hoped would remain in the recesses of my past. The first time I truly listened, it was as though the darkness itself had taken on a malevolent life, scrutinizing me with a merciless intensity. I pressed my hand to my chest, feeling the rapid thud of my heartbeat, and realized with dawning horror that every secret, every moment of professional disgrace, was being laid bare before an unseen tribunal. The next morning, still rattled by the previous night's spectral whispers, I tried to steady my nerves over a half-hearted breakfast. Yet the dread clung to me like a second skin. I kept replaying the voices in my mind, their accusatory tones interlaced with the soft tapping that had become my unwelcome lullaby. It was then that Claire, who had her own reservations about our new home, finally experienced something she could no longer rationalize away. That afternoon, as the heavy autumn light filtered through the lace curtains, Claire and I sat in the parlor discussing the day's events. Her voice, usually imbued with an unwavering cheer, was subdued and laced with palpable fear. "Marcus," she began, hesitating as if the words themselves might summon something worse, "last night, I saw something in the hall." She paused, wringing her hands together. It wasn't just a shadow. I felt a presence, as if someone was standing right behind me. And I heard whispers. I swear I heard whispers that sounded like they were calling my name. I searched her eyes for evidence of exaggeration but found only genuine terror and disbelief. "Claire, you're not imagining things," I said softly, though inside I was struggling to reconcile my own mounting dread with her accounts. "The house, this place, seems to be stirring memories, unearthing secrets that none of us ever wanted to confront." Her face paled further at my words, and for a moment, the roles seemed reversed. Here I was, the detective accustomed to dealing with facts, now at the mercy of an intangible force that thrived on our deepest fears and regrets. In an effort to dispel the growing miasma of uncertainty, I resolved to dig deeper into the town's archives. With the journal's cryptic hints as my only guide, I ventured into the old records room at the local library, a musty sanctuary of forgotten lore and brittle documents. There, amidst the labyrinth of yellowed newspapers, brittle ledgers, and hand-stitched maps, I sought clues about the series of mysterious deaths and disappearances that had long plagued Hollow Glen. Each document I uncovered painted a picture of a community haunted by tragedy. I read about families whose members had vanished without a trace, and about previous homeowners whose lives had ended in inexplicable, often violent, circumstances. A pattern began to emerge. Every tale of woe was punctuated by the same eerie motifs, persistent tapping, the appearance of shadowy figures, and cryptic symbols that no one seemed able to explain. As I sifted through these records, the hours turned to days, and my isolation deepened. The more I learned, the more I felt as if I were being drawn into a vortex of shared misfortune, a legacy of guilt and despair that had been festering in the dark corners of Hollow Glen for generations. The town's history, steeped in whispered rumors and half-truths, resonated with the despair that Eleanor had chronicled. It was as if each loss, each disappearance, was a thread in a tapestry woven by forces far beyond mortal comprehension. One afternoon, after a particularly long session poring over archival documents, I returned home with my mind reeling and my body aching from the strain of sleepless nights. It was then that I noticed something strange, something that defied explanation. While examining a faded, worn scar on my forearm, I saw, as if by magic, a series of symbols etched faintly into my skin. They glowed with a dim, unearthly light before fading into nothingness as quickly as they had appeared. My heart hammered as I traced the patterns with trembling fingers, the lines and curves bearing an uncanny resemblance to those drawn in Eleanor's desperate entries. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, a visceral reminder that the curse, or perhaps the malevolent force at work in this house, was not limited to the realms of the unseen. It had begun to manifest upon me, marking me as if I were part of some ancient, infernal ledger of sins. The experience left me shaken, a living testament to the idea that the horrors of Hollow Glen were not confined to whispered voices or spectral apparitions. I found myself unable to escape the sensation that every inch of my body was being observed by a force that sought to expose every hidden shame. It was as though the house was reasserting its claim over me, reminding me that in its realm, secrets could not remain buried. That very night, determined to capture evidence of these phenomena, I set up a recorder in the study. I arranged it carefully on the desk beside Eleanor's journal, positioning it to capture any sounds that might betray the presence of the unseen. I sat in the dim glow of a single lamp, the room heavy with anticipation, and waited. For hours, I listened as the silence stretched out, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the old house settling. Then, around the witching hour, the recorder began to pick up something that made my blood run cold. At first, it was a low, almost imperceptible hum, like the sound of distant wind chimes in a barren courtyard. But soon, that hum twisted into disjointed voices, layered and overlapping, reciting fragments of sentences I could barely comprehend. I listened intently as the voices grew louder, their timbre distorted by static yet chilling in their clarity. One voice, in particular, cut through the murmur with an accusatory tone. "You cannot hide, you cannot escape," the words repeated in a loop, as if the demon that haunted these walls was reminding me of an unalterable truth. I rewound the recording and played it again, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of the garbled phrases. The voices seemed to articulate my deepest fears, dredging up memories of a past I had desperately tried to leave behind, a past that whispered of betrayal, corruption, and a burden of guilt that refused to fade with time. The more I listened, the more convinced I became that these were not random sounds but deliberate, malevolent echoes, each one meticulously crafted to unmask the hidden sins festering within me. It was as if the house itself, through the medium of these ghostly recordings, was engaging in a cruel form of confession, forcing me to confront the darkness I had long concealed beneath layers of duty and denial. The next morning, still reeling from the night's revelations, I sought solace in the one place that had become both a refuge and a torment, the antique mirror in our bedroom. I had avoided it in recent days, fearing what its shattered surface might reveal, but now I found myself compelled to face it once more. As I stood before the mirror, I watched with a mix of dread and morbid fascination as my reflection wavered and contorted. For a moment, the image shifted, morphing into a distorted version of myself, a man marked by regret, his eyes hollow and haunted by specters of past misdeeds. The reflection was not just a simple echo of my appearance but a tapestry of my inner turmoil, stitched together by every failure, every mistake that had defined my life. The mirror seemed to pulsate with the energy of 1,000 unspoken confessions, each one echoing the sinister rhythm of the tapping that had become the heartbeat of Hollow Glen. As I stared, transfixed by the grotesque parade of my own memories, I could almost hear the mirror whispering in a language that transcended sound, a silent dirge that reverberated through the very core of my being. I knew then that I was not merely a passive observer in this unfolding nightmare. The house was drawing me into its vortex of despair, feeding on my guilt and amplifying my inner demons until they took on a life of their own. The lines between past and present, between the tangible and the spectral, were dissolving before my eyes. In the days that followed, the whispers grew louder and more insistent. I found that even in moments of attempted reprieve, they would invade my thoughts, each murmur a caustic reminder of every sin I had ever committed. My attempts to find solace in the rationality of my work as a detective were futile, the investigative mind that had once prided itself on cold logic was now besieged by emotions too raw and truths too painful to ignore. One particularly harrowing evening, as the wind howled like a chorus of mourning souls outside and the temperature in the house plummeted, I resolved to confront the phenomenon head-on. With the recorder in hand and a trembling resolve, I ventured into the heart of the night. I set the device in the study, ensuring it captured the ambient sounds of the house, and sat motionless, letting the silence envelope me. Hours later, as the clock's hands inched toward an ungodly hour, I awoke from a fitful slumber to the sound of my own labored breathing. I reached for the recorder and pressed play. The room filled with the overlapping voices once again, but this time, amidst the static and the low hum, I distinctly heard a familiar cadence, a voice that seemed to be my own, but laden with an accusatory lilt I had never known. "You can't run from the truth, you must face it," the words reverberated in my ears, mingling with the incessant tapping that now seemed to mark the passage of time itself. I listened over and over, each replay deepening the chasm of despair within me. The realization hit with the force of a physical blow. These voices were not random echoes but a mirror of my own hidden confessions, an auditory manifestation of the guilt that had haunted me for years. It was as if the house had unearthed every buried sin and was now forcing them into the light, one spectral whisper at a time. At dawn, my mind reeling and body trembling, I approached Claire. I recounted every detail, the whispers that spoke of my misdeeds, the eerie recordings that captured my unspoken confessions, and the mirror's monstrous reflection of my soul. Claire's eyes widened with a mixture of terror and disbelief. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice barely audible, this is beyond anything I imagined. "We have to do something before this consumes you entirely." Her concern, though genuine, did little to alleviate the crushing weight of the revelations I'd unearthed. I could only nod, knowing that the path before us was as treacherous as it was inevitable. That day, I resolved to document every instance of the supernatural encounters, every whisper, every inexplicable symbol that appeared and vanished as though in deliberate mockery of my sanity. I began to maintain a detailed log, a blend of journal entries and recorded EVPs, hoping that by cataloging these experiences, I might someday piece together the true nature of the darkness that haunted Hollow Glen. Each entry was a desperate attempt to cling to reality, even as the boundaries between my inner torment and the external horrors of the house blurred. Yet, as I scribbled down yet another entry, I felt a chill wash over me, a cold, suffocating realization that the mirror's distorted images were not merely a reflection of my guilt, but a window into a reality where every hidden sin demanded its due. In that moment, standing in the half-light of the study with the recorder still playing the ghostly voices in the background, I knew that my journey into the heart of this nightmare was far from over. The whispers in the dark had only just begun their relentless assault, and I was left to wonder if there would ever be an escape from the past, or from the curse that now bound me to Hollow Glen. And as the last vestiges of night receded into a new, uncertain dawn, I could only brace myself for what lay ahead, knowing that each whisper, each echo of regret, was drawing me inexorably closer to a truth too terrible to fully comprehend. The oppressive atmosphere of Hollow Glen had reached a fever pitch. Every creak of the ancient floorboards, every whisper in the dark, bore into my mind with relentless intensity. I found myself trapped in a vortex of guilt and spectral accusations, a prison built of my own hidden sins. It was as though the house had become an active participant in my internal torment, dredging up long-buried memories and exposing the darkness I had fought so desperately to conceal. In the early light of one particularly bleak morning, when the mist outside clung to the windows like a shroud, I knew there was no escape from the truth any longer. The relentless tapping, the voices in the night, and the ghastly reflections in the shattered mirror had all conspired to force a confession, a confession that had haunted me for years. I could no longer ignore the gnawing pain that reminded me of my greatest failure, the one case that had defined my professional disgrace. It began with a quiet, solitary moment in the study. I sat at the battered wooden desk, the pages of Eleanor's journal still spread before me, its desperate words mingling with my own turbulent thoughts. The silence was broken only by the steady, insistent tapping that had become the heartbeat of this cursed place. In that suffocating quiet, I finally allowed the dam of my repressed memories to break. I picked up my pen and, with a shaking hand, began to write a confession to no one in particular. My words spilled out in jagged lines, raw and unfiltered, a recounting of the unsolved murder case that had once defined my career. I recalled the day when I had been tasked with investigating a brutal homicide in the heart of the city. I had been a rising star in the department then, a detective with a reputation for integrity and a relentless pursuit of justice. But the case was unlike any other. The victim was a young man, his life snuffed out by a series of calculated, merciless blows, and the evidence was damning. Yet, in a moment of crippling fear and weakness, I had allowed corruption and my own self-doubt to dictate my actions. I compromised the investigation, withholding crucial evidence in exchange for promises of safety and career advancement, a betrayal that still haunted me in my quiet moments. As the words formed on the paper, I felt a mix of shame and reluctant relief. The confession was not just an admission of professional failure, it was an exposure of the deepest, most secret shame that had festered within me. The demon that now haunted these walls seemed to grow louder as if it thrived on the revelation of guilt. I could almost hear its mocking laughter in the back of my mind, a cruel reminder that the sins of the past were not easily erased. Later that day, after I had finished my confession, I hesitantly sought out Claire. We sat in the parlor, the late afternoon light streaming weakly through the dusty windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. I could see the concern in her eyes as she regarded me, eyes that had watched me sink deeper into an obsession with the house's haunted past. The tension between us had grown palpable in recent days, fueled by the inexplicable events and the secrets that now began to spill forth. "Marcus," Claire said softly, her voice trembling with both empathy and apprehension, "I've noticed you've been distant. You're not yourself. What's been going on?" Her eyes searched mine, pleading for an explanation, for some sign that I was still the man she once knew. I hesitated, the weight of my confession pressing down on me like a millstone. But I knew that if I were to find any semblance of redemption, or even just a way to survive the malevolent forces that now tormented us, I had to share the truth. With a deep, shuddering breath, I began to speak. I told her everything, the compromised investigation, the unresolved murder that had marred my career, the fear that had driven me to make choices I would forever regret. My voice trembled as I recounted the details, each word a painful acknowledgement of the past. I could see the shock and sorrow in Claire's eyes, but there was also something else, a recognition of shared vulnerability. After my confession, a long silence settled between us, heavy with unspoken thoughts and emotions. Finally, with tears glistening in her eyes, Claire confessed her own hidden insecurities. She spoke of her deep-seated fear of failure, of the pressure to be the pillar of strength for everyone around her, and of the secret self-doubt that had plagued her for years. Her voice was barely a whisper, but each word resonated with a raw honesty that forged a new, tentative bond between us. In that moment, we found solace in each other's brokenness, a fragile alliance built on the mutual understanding that we were both haunted by the ghosts of our past. No sooner had we laid our souls bare than the house responded with a fury that defied explanation. The very air in Hollow Glen seemed to tremble with malevolence. It started with an earth-shattering crash in the hallway, a cacophony of sound that echoed off the walls as if the house itself were rebelling against our confessions. The rhythmic tapping that had once been a constant, insidious background note now erupted into violent, erratic bursts. I was thrown to the floor by the sheer force of it, my body racked with shock and fear as shards of our fragile reality splintered around me. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my ears, as I tried to make sense of the chaos. It was then that I saw it, a dark, shifting presence materializing at the far end of the hall, a silhouette that moved with an unnerving grace, its form indistinct yet undeniably menacing. The apparition seemed to target me specifically, its hollow eyes fixed on me with a predatory intensity. In that moment, I realized the horrifying truth. The demon that haunted Hollow Glen preyed selectively on those burdened with guilt and solitude. It fed on the darkest parts of our souls, amplifying every hidden sin and regret until they became almost tangible. And I, with my long-hidden confession and the raw shame of my past, was its perfect target. The assault was both psychological and physical. As the demon's influence surged through the corridors, my surroundings twisted into a nightmarish landscape of distorted memories and hallucinations. Every corner of the house seemed to close in on me, every shadow became a manifestation of my own failures. I saw visions of the unsolved murder play out before my eyes, the anguished cry of the victim, the cold indifference of those who had been complicit in my betrayal, the crushing despair of a life wasted by cowardice. These visions weren't mere echoes of the past, they were being manipulated and amplified by the malevolent force, each image a brutal reminder of my own unworthiness. At the height of the onslaught, I felt as if my very soul was being shredded by the relentless barrage of memories and spectral accusations. The demon's presence was palpable, a suffocating force that wrapped itself around me and whispered venomous truths in a voice that was disturbingly like my own. "You are unworthy, Marcus," it hissed, each syllable laced with contempt. "You will never escape the darkness within you." I staggered backward, feeling my resolve crumble as the assault on my psyche intensified. Claire, ever my steadfast ally even in the midst of our shared despair, rushed to my side. With a look of fierce determination and raw, unguarded emotion, she enveloped me in a tight embrace. "We have to stand together," she urged, her voice trembling with urgency. "This demon, whatever it is, it's trying to tear us apart. But we can't let it win. We have to fight it, face it, together." In that moment, our bond was sealed by the shared agony of our past and the desperate need for survival. The revelation of our deepest secrets had not only exposed our vulnerabilities but also forged a connection that could serve as our only hope against the encroaching darkness. Even as we clung to each other, the house continued its onslaught. Objects flew through the air with a violent force, smashing against walls and sending shards of broken glass scattering like deadly confetti. The very structure of Hollow Glen seemed to convulse with the energy of our tormented confessions. Amid the chaos, the antique mirror in the hallway shattered with a deafening crash, its fragments glinting like splinters of lost hope across the floor. I watched, heart in my throat, as the mirror's remnants skittered across the polished wood, each shard reflecting a distorted image of the horrors that now surrounded us. In that harrowing moment, I realized with an almost unbearable clarity that the demon's power was not arbitrary, it was meticulously calibrated to exploit our guilt and isolation. It had been lying in wait, feeding on the hidden sins of its victims, growing stronger with every unspoken confession, every whispered regret. And now that our darkest truths had been laid bare, it roared with a vindictive fury, as if to assert its dominion over our souls. The violent manifestations seemed to crescendo into a nightmarish climax. I was momentarily overwhelmed by a barrage of images, glimpses of my former self as a detective consumed by ambition and pride, now reduced to a broken man, trapped in a house that seemed to mock every effort I made to reclaim my honor. The room spun around me, and for a brief, terrifying instant, I lost all sense of time and space. In that void, the only certainty was the demonic presence that whispered incessantly, "You are not alone in your guilt. You are mine." Amid this maelstrom of terror, I found solace in the steady strength of Claire's presence. Her grip on my hand was firm, a silent promise that she would not let go even if the darkness threatened to tear us apart. "Marcus," she murmured through clenched teeth, "we must hold on. We have to be stronger than our past. We have to stand together, or else this place will consume us entirely." Her words, though delivered in a voice strained by fear and resolve, offered a beacon of hope amidst the swirling chaos. In that moment, a new clarity began to emerge from the tumult. I realized that the path forward would require more than a confession of guilt. It would demand a complete reckoning with the parts of myself that I had long denied. The demon's assault, as brutal as it was, had forced me to confront the truth. I could not run from the darkness inside me any longer. If I were to stand any chance of surviving Hollow Glen, I had to embrace every painful truth and transform that shame into a weapon against the malevolent force that sought to enslave us. In the following hours, as the supernatural fury slowly subsided into a strained, haunted quiet, Claire and I gathered what strength we could muster to assess the damage. The house was eerily still now, the remnants of shattered glass and overturned furniture serving as grim reminders of the night's violence. We sat together in the dim glow of a single lamp, our breaths heavy with exhaustion and our minds reeling from the revelations that had been forced upon us. I took a deep, shuddering breath and looked at Claire with renewed determination. "I have to confront my past, Claire," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I have to face every hidden sin, every moment of cowardice that has defined me. Only then can I hope to break free of this curse, this demon that preys on our guilt." Her eyes, glistening with unshed tears and fierce resolve, met mine. "Then we do it together," she replied, her voice low and resolute. "I'll stand by you, no matter how dark it gets." In that fragile alliance, amid the ruins of a house that had become the stage for our worst nightmares, I felt a spark of hope, an ember of possibility that perhaps, by uniting our shattered selves, we could overcome the relentless malevolence that had ensnared us. The journey ahead was uncertain and fraught with peril, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I believed that redemption might still be within reach. That night, as we prepared to face the darkness once more, the house seemed to settle into an ominous stillness, a deceptive calm before the inevitable storm. The whispers had quieted, but I knew that they were merely biding their time, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. And I knew, with a cold certainty, that the true test of our resolve was only just beginning. In the silent aftermath of our confessions, as the shattered remnants of the past lay scattered around us and the demon's echo still reverberated in the dark corridors of Hollow Glen, I understood one immutable truth: only by confronting the totality of our hidden sins could we hope to break free from this living nightmare. And so, with the weight of our shared guilt as both burden and weapon, Claire and I braced ourselves for the uncertain battle ahead, a battle that would demand every ounce of strength, every flicker of hope, and every whispered prayer in our desperate quest for salvation. The raw intensity of our previous night's ordeal still lingered in the corridors of my mind as I set out to uncover the origins of Hollow Glen's malevolence. The house, with its oppressive atmosphere and unyielding whispers of guilt, had shown me that its curse was not born solely of internal despair. It was rooted in a history far older and far more sinister. Determined to piece together the threads of this mystery, I began to seek out the people who had lived here long before our arrival. Armed with Eleanor Blackwood's journal and the disquieting confessions that had shaken me to my core, I ventured into the heart of the small village. The locals, steeped in years of whispered legends and furtive glances, greeted me with a blend of suspicion and resigned sorrow. I visited the modest general store, the weathered diner, and even the neglected community hall where faded photographs of bygone eras hung on the walls. In hushed tones, several villagers spoke of an ancient summoning ritual performed by the early settlers, a desperate, forbidden act meant to secure prosperity, which instead unleashed a darkness that had festered for generations. I recall one encounter in particular. An elderly man, his face lined by decades of hardship and secrets, leaned in close as he whispered, "They say the ancestors called forth a power they could not control. It was meant to protect them, but it demanded a heavy price, a curse that binds the guilty to this very land." His trembling voice, laced with both regret and fear, sent shivers down my spine. Every detail he provided resonated with the symbols I had seen etched on windows and, horrifyingly, even on my own skin. The more I listened, the more I began to see Hollow Glen as not merely a haunted house, but a nexus of ancient sin and unresolved rituals. Returning home with my mind brimming with these grim tales, I found myself drawn once more to Eleanor's journal. Late into one sleepless night, by the flickering light of a solitary lamp, I carefully reread her entries. Amid the chaotic scribbles and desperate pleas, there lay a series of cryptic passages hinting at a secret underground chamber, a hidden sanctum carved out beneath the foundations of the house. Eleanor had written of a ritual chamber, designed for communication with forces beyond mortal ken, where an incantation had once been performed in a desperate bid to sever the curse. The words were fragmented, written in haste as if she had sensed her own impending doom. I could almost feel her anguish, her battle against a power that was as consuming as it was ancient. My thoughts were abruptly interrupted one afternoon when Claire, ever my anchor in this maelstrom of darkness, was suddenly struck by a force I could neither see nor comprehend. We had been in the garden, examining an overgrown path that I suspected might lead to an undiscovered part of the property, when an invisible presence swept through her. In an instant, she cried out in agony. I rushed to her side as she clutched her arm, her face contorted with pain. There, along the delicate skin of her forearm, a series of crimson marks had appeared, iridescent and almost pulsating with an unearthly glow. The markings, intricate in design and disturbingly familiar to the symbols I had witnessed in the journal and on my skin, escalated the urgency of our investigation. They were not merely physical injuries, they were a warning, a tangible sign that the malevolent force was now marking those who dared to challenge its hold. In the wake of this attack, our shared sense of urgency deepened. The house, with its labyrinth of hidden rooms and unspoken legacies, no longer felt like a passive relic of the past but an active, vengeful entity. As if on cue, a friend from the city, an old colleague I had hoped might offer a rational perspective, arrived to lend his support. His name was Daniel, and he had come, eager to help and perhaps inject some of the pragmatic clarity that had long been the cornerstone of my investigative career. But Daniel's resolve faltered almost immediately. Within hours of his arrival, he experienced an encounter so horrifying that he bolted from the property, his face ashen, his eyes wide with terror. He spoke of corridors that twisted into impossible geometries, of a suffocating presence that chased him down dark hallways until he could run no further. His abrupt departure was a stark reminder that the forces at work in Hollow Glen were not to be trifled with. Left with only the tangible evidence of our own encounters and the murmured legends of the villagers, I realized I needed guidance from someone who understood the occult, a scholar who could decipher the layers of ritual and curse that bound this place. It was then that I decided to contact Professor Jonathan Ellis, a reclusive expert in ancient rites and forbidden lore whose own past was entangled with the dark history of Hollow Glen. I had heard whispers of his work long before my arrival, but now, desperate for any insight into the forces that tormented me, I sought him out. I arranged to meet Professor Ellis in a modest, cluttered study in the heart of town, a room filled with dusty tomes, cryptic diagrams, and relics from a time when magic was not only believed in but feared. The professor was a man in his late 50s, with sharp eyes that seemed to look beyond the present, as if they were constantly surveying the hidden layers of existence. When I recounted my experiences, my encounter with the invisible force that marked Claire, the spectral voices, and the disturbing parallels with Eleanor's journal, his expression grew somber. "Marcus," he said gravely, "what you describe is the work of an ancient curse, one that binds itself to the guilt of those who reside within these walls. Eleanor Blackwood was not an isolated victim, she was part of a lineage of souls doomed by this curse. The summoning ritual that was performed by the early settlers was meant to secure their fortunes, but it also awakened a darkness that hungers for the secret sins of men. Eleanor tried to break it, to end the cycle of retribution, but her own overwhelming guilt proved to be her undoing." His words were measured, yet each one carried the weight of hard-earned knowledge. Professor Ellis explained that the curse was not an abstract notion but a tangible force that sought to amplify the inner darkness of its victims. "The demon that haunts you," he continued, "is not a separate entity, but a manifestation of your own hidden sins. It feeds on guilt and despair, growing stronger with each secret you harbor." Eleanor's attempt to use the underground chamber as a means to end this curse failed because she could not rid herself of her own guilt. In doing so, she left behind clues, desperate clues that may yet help you sever this unholy bond. He urged me to review the journal closely once again, emphasizing the passages that mentioned the chamber. According to him, the chamber was not merely a room but a ritual space, marked by arcane symbols and designed to bridge the gap between the living and the cursed. Its location, he believed, was somewhere beneath the house, hidden away from prying eyes. The professor's insights struck me with both hope and trepidation. Here, finally, was a possibility, albeit a dangerous one, of not only understanding the curse but perhaps ending it. Yet, his tone carried an unmistakable warning. "You must proceed with caution, Marcus. The ritual required to break the curse is perilous, and it demands a sacrifice of truth. To succeed, you must confront the very depths of your own guilt. Do not underestimate the force you are dealing with." As Professor Ellis departed, leaving me with a heavy compendium of his cryptic advice, I felt the weight of our shared history pressing down on me. The path ahead was fraught with peril, and the discovery of the underground chamber promised to be the next pivotal step in this unending nightmare. I returned home with a mind swirling with questions, my heart pounding with both dread and a cautious hope that perhaps, by understanding the ancient ritual and facing my own darkness, I might finally lift the curse that had ensnared us. That evening, as twilight bled into the deep shadows of night, Claire and I pored over the professor's notes alongside Eleanor's journal. We compared the faded, hurried annotations with the architectural features of our house. Hidden passages, forgotten basements, sealed rooms, all of these possibilities danced in my mind like dark promises. The revelation that a secret chamber lay beneath us ignited a spark of determination, even as the memories of the past, my confession, the demon's wrath, the mark on Claire's arm, reminded me of the stakes at hand. Together, we resolved to search for any indication of this subterranean sanctum. Our exploration took us through narrow, dust-choked corridors and into the depths of the cellar, where the cool damp air seemed to carry echoes of ancient incantations. Every step was measured, every creak of the old wooden stairs a reminder that we were trespassing into a realm where the past and the present collided. The symbols that had haunted my skin and the recurring motifs in the journal guided us, pointing to hidden structural irregularities and a section of the wall that, upon closer inspection, bore markings too deliberate to be mere wear. As we pressed our hands against the cold stone, I could almost hear the faint echo of a long-forgotten chant, a cadence that resonated with the pulse of the earth itself. With a final, determined push, a section of the wall shifted, revealing a narrow passageway descending into darkness. My heart pounded as I stepped forward, the dim beam of my flashlight cutting through the oppressive gloom. Every step into the passage was accompanied by the echo of our earlier confessions, a ghostly reminder that the house had a way of dredging up everything we tried to leave behind. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and ancient decay. The narrow corridor opened into a small chamber, its walls adorned with the same cryptic symbols I had seen in Eleanor's desperate entries. Broken artifacts, remnants of long-abandoned rituals, and fragments of shattered mirrors lay scattered across the floor. In the center of the room, a stone altar bore carvings that seemed to pulse with an inner light, as though it were alive with the energy of countless lost souls. I felt a presence here, not entirely malevolent, but sorrowful, an echo of Eleanor's final, desperate attempt to free herself from the curse. I knelt before the altar, my mind racing with a mix of dread and a grim determination. The chamber whispered of secrets too terrible to fully comprehend, yet it also held the promise of redemption, a way to confront the darkness both within and without. Claire's hand on my shoulder anchored me, her quiet strength a reminder that I was not alone in this descent into madness. The symbols on the walls, the cold stone beneath my fingertips, and the faint murmurs that drifted through the air all converged into a single, resonant truth. The curse was as real as the guilt that had brought me to this moment, and only by facing it head-on could I hope to break its hold. In that silent, haunted chamber, with the weight of generations of sorrow and secret rituals pressing in from every side, I vowed to uncover every hidden truth, even if it meant exposing the darkest corners of my own soul. The discovery of the chamber had set me on a path from which there was no turning back. I could feel the pulse of ancient incantations, the energy of a long-forgotten rite calling out from the depths of time, urging me onward. As I retraced my steps back to the upper floors, the house seemed to murmur with renewed purpose. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of light in the darkness, confirmed that Hollow Glen was alive with the memories of its tragic past. And in that echoing labyrinth of guilt and despair, I knew that our next steps, however perilous, would be the final confrontation with the curse that had defined us for so long. And as the chill of the underground air faded into the dark corridors above, I could not help but feel that the true battle was yet to come, a battle against the forces that had awakened in the hidden recesses of Hollow Glen, and a confrontation with the inner demons that had made me a target of this ancient, relentless curse. The day after our discovery of the hidden passage in the cellar, the oppressive weight of anticipation seemed to press upon every brick of Hollow Glen. Claire and I spent that morning poring over every detail in Eleanor's journal and Professor Ellis's cryptic notes, our fingers tracing the faded script that hinted at a subterranean ritual chamber. The revelations of the past and the dark energies that had followed us since our arrival converged into one single, inescapable truth. Beneath the very foundation of this accursed house lay a secret chamber, a locus of ancient rites and tortured memories. Late in the afternoon, with the low autumn sun casting long, eerie shadows across the parlor, we prepared ourselves for the descent. I double-checked the lantern and flashlight, while Claire carefully packed a small bag containing the few necessities we might need. Every object felt heavy with significance, as if the tools of our investigation were imbued with the same foreboding that had plagued us since day one. We returned to the entrance of the passage, a narrow gap in the cellar wall, its rough-hewn stones bearing cryptic carvings that echoed the symbols from Eleanor's final entries. As I pushed aside a stubborn stone slab, a chill wind escaped from the darkness, as though the secret chamber were exhaling after a long, silent vigil. My heart pounded with both dread and grim determination. I knew that beyond that threshold lay not only the remnants of an ancient ritual but also the key to breaking the curse that had slowly ensnared us. Stepping into the passage, the narrow corridor immediately swallowed the light, plunging us into a realm where time and space seemed to lose their meaning. The air was cool and moist, carrying a deep, earthy aroma that mingled with the unmistakable tang of old incense and decay. Every footstep we took reverberated off the rough stone walls, as if we were disturbing the long-held silence of an entity that had slumbered undisturbed for centuries. As we advanced, I felt as if the passage itself were alive. Its uneven surfaces seemed to pulse with an ancient rhythm, a heartbeat that echoed the tapping I had heard for so many nights. The walls, scarred with mysterious symbols and half-erased inscriptions, whispered secrets in a language older than memory. I pressed my hand against the cool stone, feeling a shudder ripple through my fingers, a silent affirmation that we were no longer in the realm of the ordinary. After what felt like an eternity in that subterranean corridor, the passage opened into a cavernous chamber. The secret chamber sprawled before us in a dim, flickering light provided by our lantern. Every detail was shrouded in mystery: tall, arched ceilings lost in shadows, walls adorned with cryptic carvings that spiraled in patterns reminiscent of ancient incantations, and scattered relics that hinted at a long-forgotten ritual. At the very center of the chamber, an imposing stone altar dominated the space, its surface worn smooth by the countless rituals that had taken place upon it. The altar's carvings glowed faintly, as though animated by a pulsating, inner light that resonated with the somber energy of the room. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat as I surveyed the altar. It was as if every chiseled line and engraved symbol told a story of despair, guilt, and a desperate yearning for redemption. In one corner of the chamber, I noticed a series of shattered mirror fragments scattered across the cold, stone floor. Their broken surfaces reflected distorted images of our own faces, merging our present with the spectral echoes of those who had come before us. For a moment, the images blurred, and I saw not just my own visage but the anguished eyes of Eleanor Blackwood, a silent witness to the tragic rituals that had haunted this place. The silence in the chamber was thick and oppressive, punctuated only by the low, rhythmic hum that seemed to emanate from the very stones beneath our feet. I could feel the pulse of ancient incantations vibrate in the air, a slow, hypnotic cadence that drew me inexorably toward the altar. My mind swirled with conflicting emotions, terror mingled with a strange, almost magnetic curiosity about what lay ahead. As I knelt before the altar, I traced my fingers over its carved surface, the cool stone sending shivers up my arm. In that moment, the room shifted. The silence was shattered by a sudden, low murmur, a voice that seemed both distant and intimately familiar. At first, it was nothing more than a whisper, as if the very walls were murmuring secrets long held in the darkness. Then, the murmur swelled into a series of fragmented phrases, a litany of regrets and accusations that sounded uncomfortably like my own inner voice. Face your sins. Embrace the truth, it intoned, the words echoing in the vast emptiness of the chamber. I felt the oppressive force of the curse pressing down on me, each whispered word a reminder of every hidden failure, every secret sin that had led me to this fateful moment. Images flashed before my eyes, a montage of my past transgressions, the compromised investigation, the guilt that had gnawed at my conscience like a relentless parasite. It was as if the chamber had become a crucible, burning away the pretense of self-deception to reveal the raw, unvarnished truth of my soul. Before I could fully process the torrent of memories, a shadow detached itself from the darkness near the altar. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if testing the boundaries of its own existence. I squinted in the dim light and, to my horror, recognized the faint outline of a woman. In that brief, shuddering moment, I was certain it was Eleanor, her spectral figure draped in tattered robes, her eyes filled with sorrow and an unspoken plea for deliverance. For an instant, time seemed to slow, and I could almost feel her reaching out, her silent desperation merging with my own tortured guilt. Then, as if summoned by the intensity of our mutual anguish, the chamber trembled. The low hum of the ancient incantation grew louder, and the symbols on the walls began to glow with a fierce, otherworldly light. The temperature dropped sharply, and an unseen force seemed to gather in the center of the room, swirling around the altar in a vortex of shadow and light. In that charged moment, the demon's presence, ever lurking at the periphery of my consciousness, revealed itself in a more defined, terrifying form. A mass of writhing darkness coalesced at the far end of the chamber. It moved with deliberate malice, its shape constantly shifting, never fully defined. Yet, even in its amorphous state, there was a malevolence that made my blood run cold. The demon's voice, now clear and mocking, echoed throughout the chamber, "You dare to unburden your soul? Your sins are not yours alone to bear, they belong to the void, and you will pay the price for your defiance." The words cut through the tumult like a shard of ice. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized that the demon was not simply an external force, it was the embodiment of the curse that fed on our guilt, an entity that had grown powerful through the weight of our hidden transgressions. Every whispered secret, every confession of regret, had strengthened its grip on Hollow Glen and on me. Panic surged within me, and I staggered backward, my eyes darting desperately around the chamber for an escape that did not exist. But then I felt Claire's hand on my shoulder, her grip steady and resolute. "Marcus, stand firm," she urged softly, her voice a lifeline amidst the chaos. "Remember who you are. We are not defined by our past mistakes. We have each other, and we will face this darkness together." Her words cut through the haze of fear, offering a momentary anchor to the fading fragments of my sanity. I closed my eyes, taking a deep, trembling breath, and focused on the sound of her voice. Slowly, I pushed myself back toward the altar, determined to reclaim the inner strength that the demon sought to shatter. The chamber seemed to pulse in response, as if acknowledging the defiant spark within me. I stood before the altar once again, my hand raised to trace the ancient symbols that adorned its surface. The glowing carvings pulsed beneath my fingertips, and I could feel the energy of the ritual seeping into me, a dangerous, intoxicating power born of both hope and despair. The demon's voice returned, softer now but laced with an undercurrent of ominous inevitability. "Sacrifice," it murmured, the word echoing in my mind like a death knell. "Only through the ultimate sacrifice can the curse be broken. Your soul must be laid bare, your sins offered as penance." In that moment, the truth became painfully clear. The path to liberation from this nightmare was not merely one of confession and confrontation, it required an act of self-abnegation, a willingness to surrender the very essence of my being to purge the darkness within. It was a revelation that struck me with both terror and an unexpected sense of clarity. I realized that the curse had always demanded more than just acknowledgement, it required a reckoning, a sacrifice that could only come from an honest confrontation with the deepest recesses of my soul. The pressure in the chamber mounted as the demon's form loomed ever closer. Its shadowy tendrils reached out, caressing the edges of my consciousness, threatening to engulf me in the despair of 1,000 unatoned sins. Yet, bolstered by Claire's unwavering presence and my own flickering resolve, I steeled myself for what lay ahead. I had come too far to now retreat into the comforting embrace of denial. "Then I will pay the price," I whispered, my voice trembling but resolute. "If my soul must be the sacrifice to end this curse, then so be it." I refused to let my guilt feed this darkness any longer. My declaration, raw and defiant, resonated in the vast silence of the chamber. For a moment, time seemed to still as if the very fabric of reality were waiting to see if I would truly commit to this final, perilous act. The demon's mocking laughter faded into a low, menacing murmur, as if it were gauging the sincerity of my resolve. The symbols on the altar flared brighter, and the air crackled with a power that defied explanation. In that charged moment, I felt the presence of every lost soul that had ever been ensnared by this curse, the victims of unspeakable tragedies, the tormented spirits of those who had dared to challenge fate. Their silent testimonies filled the chamber with a palpable sorrow and a desperate longing for redemption. Claire squeezed my hand tightly as I stepped closer to the altar. "Marcus, whatever happens, know that I believe in you," she said softly, her eyes shining with both tears and fierce determination. "This curse does not have to define us. You have the power to change your fate, even if it means sacrificing everything." Her words bolstered my resolve, and I closed my eyes for a brief moment, summoning every ounce of strength and conviction I possessed. I envisioned the many faces of those who had suffered under the weight of this curse, the haunted eyes of Eleanor, the silent pleas of lost souls, and felt their pain intertwine with my own. In that merging of collective sorrow and determination, I discovered a spark of hope that defied the darkness. Slowly, I reached for a small, ornate dagger that lay hidden among the relics on a nearby shelf, a ceremonial instrument that, according to Eleanor's desperate scribbles, might serve as the key to severing the demonic bond. Its handle was cool and intricately carved with symbols that mirrored those on the altar. With trembling hands, I grasped the dagger and held it aloft, feeling its weight both physical and symbolic. The chamber responded as the glow of the altar's carvings intensified, bathing the room in an ethereal light that seemed to blur the line between the living and the dead. In that moment, as the demon's shadow writhed in defiant protest and the echoes of ancient incantations filled the air, I prepared to offer my most painful truth, the essence of my guilt and the culmination of every hidden sin. I understood that the sacrifice demanded by the curse was not an end, but a beginning, a painful, purifying act that would either set me free or condemn me forever. With a final, resolute exhalation, I pressed the dagger to my chest, feeling the cold steel meet my skin. The pain was immediate, a searing burn that radiated through every fiber of my being. But even as the shock coursed through me, I felt something else, a strange warmth emanating from deep within, as if the act of surrendering my own shame had ignited a spark of cathartic transformation. In that moment, the chamber seemed to vibrate with an energy both terrible and magnificent, as if the ancient forces at work were finally acknowledging my sacrifice. The demon's voice, now almost a whisper, seemed to recede into the background, replaced by a chorus of soft, mournful tones, a litany of regrets and forgiveness, intermingled with the promise of renewal. I staggered, barely able to remain upright, as the pain of my confession merged with a profound sense of release. The symbols on the walls pulsed in tandem with my heartbeat, and for a fleeting instant, I saw a vision of light breaking through the darkness, a vision that hinted at the possibility of redemption. Claire rushed to my side, her face etched with concern and relief. "Marcus, hold on," she cried, her voice trembling as she tried to steady me. In that moment, I realized that this act of sacrifice was not the end of our struggle but the beginning of a long, arduous journey toward healing. The demon's presence, though diminished, was not entirely vanquished, its lingering whispers promised that the battle was far from over. As I collapsed to the cold stone floor, the dagger slipping from my grasp, I clung to the hope that the curse could be broken, that the torment of the past might finally be laid to rest. The chamber, once a mausoleum of despair, now pulsed with the possibility of transformation. The demonic murmur faded into a distant echo, and the overwhelming weight of guilt began to lift, replaced by a bittersweet relief that was tempered with uncertainty. In the silent aftermath, as Claire cradled me in her arms and the ethereal light slowly waned, I knew that our journey had reached a critical turning point. The secret chamber had revealed the true nature of the curse, a darkness that fed on our inner demons but could be confronted only by embracing the full measure of our humanity. My sacrifice had been the key, the painful offering that might sever the demonic tether that had haunted us since the day we arrived in Hollow Glen. And so, with the last flicker of light in that ancient chamber, I vowed to continue the fight, not just for my own redemption, but for all the souls lost to the relentless grip of guilt and despair. The price had been steep, and the path ahead remained shrouded in uncertainty, but as Claire's warm hand steadied mine and the echoes of the past receded into silence, I felt the faint stirrings of hope. It was a fragile hope, born of sacrifice and sorrow, yet it held the promise of a future free from the tyranny of our darkest secrets. As the chamber's oppressive shadows gave way to a tentative calm, I closed my eyes and whispered a silent prayer, a prayer for forgiveness, for strength, and for the courage to face the uncharted road ahead. The secret chamber, with all its tragic history and spectral echoes, had become both a tomb of old sins and a crucible for new beginnings. And in that sacred, hallowed space beneath Hollow Glen, I understood that the true journey toward salvation had only just begun. In the wake of the harrowing sacrifice in the secret chamber, the atmosphere of Hollow Glen grew even more volatile, as if the very air were charged with the remnants of ancient incantations and desperate pleas. In the days that followed, the boundaries between memory and nightmare, between guilt and redemption, began to blur with an intensity that threatened to shatter my already fragile sanity. I found myself caught in a relentless whirlwind of visions and inexplicable phenomena, a convergence of shadows that drew together every dark thread woven through the history of this accursed place. It was in the early hours of one rain-lashed morning that I met with Professor Jonathan Ellis. The professor had become my reluctant guide through the labyrinth of occult lore and forbidden rituals. We gathered in a cramped study within a decaying building at the edge of town, a room lined with dusty tomes, brittle manuscripts, and relics that seemed to pulse with their own ancient life. Ellis's eyes, ever watchful and filled with quiet sorrow, bore into me as he spread out a series of yellowed pages, occult texts that he'd painstakingly compiled over years of research. Intermixed with Eleanor Blackwood's desperate scribbles, these texts held the promise of an answer, a ritual that might finally sever the cursed bond that tethered us to the demon's relentless influence. "Marcus," Ellis said, his voice low and measured, "this ritual is unlike anything you've ever encountered. It draws on powers older than our own, forces that must be handled with extreme caution. If you attempt it, you must be prepared to confront not only the demon but every shadow of guilt that festers within you." His words reverberated through the small room, each syllable laden with the weight of his own haunted past. I nodded, a grim determination coalescing in my chest. There was no other path left. The demon had grown too powerful, its presence now a constant, oppressive companion that whispered in every crevice of my mind. Over the next several days, Claire and I devoted ourselves to preparing for the ritual. We meticulously cross-referenced every fragment of Eleanor's journal with Ellis's arcane texts, mapping out the exact symbols, incantations, and positions required to open a gateway that could finally expel the malevolent force from Hollow Glen. The process was both physically and mentally draining. Every moment spent poring over the texts was punctuated by the resurgence of guilt-laden visions, ghostly images of my past transgressions, the cold, accusing eyes of those I had failed, and the relentless echo of the demon's mocking voice. My nights became a restless tapestry of half-formed dreams and waking hallucinations. I saw flashes of the unsolved murder replaying over and over, a stark reminder of the guilt that had haunted me for years. In these visions, the demon's face loomed large, contorting into grotesque forms as it whispered fragments of my deepest regrets. Sometimes, I would awaken with a start, drenched in sweat, as if the weight of my own guilt had manifested into physical torment. Yet, with each passing nightmare, the lines between reality and nightmare blurred further, until I no longer knew if the demon's presence was confined to the echoing corridors of Hollow Glen or had seeped into my very soul. Despite the mounting internal chaos, Claire emerged as a beacon of steadfast resolve. Concern etched deeply into her features, she took it upon herself to rally support among the villagers, a task I once believed might lend us a semblance of solidarity. Yet every conversation, every furtive glance exchanged in the dim light of the local diner or over the counter at the general store, revealed that fear and denial reigned supreme. The townsfolk, bound by their own secret histories and an unspoken loyalty to a past steeped in dread, refused to acknowledge the full extent of the curse. "It's just old legends," they would murmur, eyes darting away as if afraid to meet mine. Their words stung with a mixture of pity and disbelief, leaving me isolated in a battle against a darkness that even the community could not or would not confront. One evening, as dusk bled into a heavy, oppressive night, I returned home to find the familiar sense of disorientation deepening. The walls of Hollow Glen seemed to breathe, their surfaces pulsing with a latent, malignant energy. I sat in the study, the occult text spread before me, when a sudden, violent shudder rippled through my body. In that moment, the room darkened, and the oppressive silence was shattered by a guttural, distorted voice that emerged not from any external source, but from within me. "Marcus," it intoned, a sound that was at once my own and yet chillingly alien. The voice, laced with the venom of centuries of accumulated sin, forced my eyes shut. I felt my limbs go numb as the demonic force, emboldened by my mounting vulnerability, took control. I staggered backward, clutching at the desk as a series of images erupted behind closed eyelids, a montage of the demon's dark history in Hollow Glen, scenes of rituals long forgotten, and the anguished cries of those who had once been sacrificed to this curse. In that harrowing moment, I experienced a psychic episode, a torrent of visions that revealed the full extent of the demon's malevolence. I saw the ancient settlers, their faces contorted in desperation as they chanted incantations beneath a blood-red moon. I saw Eleanor, her final moments of torment interwoven with the demon's insidious laughter, and I saw countless souls, lost and suffering, all bound to the curse by their own hidden transgressions. Each vision was a brutal revelation, a reminder that the darkness feeding on our guilt was not an isolated force but a collective manifestation of every secret sin that had ever been committed in this forsaken place. For a moment, I lost myself entirely in the psychic onslaught. The demons will forced me into terrifying, uncontrollable movements. I could feel its presence crawling along my skin, a cold, unyielding pressure that threatened to smother every hope of redemption. My own voice, distorted and laden with sorrow, emerged from my lips. "I am not your slave. I will not be your vessel." Yet even as I uttered these defiant words, the demon's control tightened, leaving me teetering on the edge of complete psychological isolation. When I finally emerged from the grip of the possession, I was left trembling on the floor, my vision blurred with tears and my thoughts scattered like shattered glass. Claire, who had rushed to my side, knelt beside me, her eyes brimming with fear and concern. "Marcus, talk to me," she pleaded softly, her hand gently stroking my arm as if trying to erase the indelible marks of the demon's intrusion. I struggled to find my voice, to convey the enormity of the terror I had just experienced, a terror not only born of the curse but one that threatened to consume every fragment of my identity. In the days that followed, the demonic possession recurred with alarming frequency. The entity would seize control of me at the most inopportune moments, during quiet moments when I thought I was alone, or in the midst of our ritual preparations. Each time, I was forced to bear witness to the twisted narrative of the demon's dark history in Hollow Glen. It revealed to me the hidden lineage of sins that had bound this house and its inhabitants, a continuous thread of guilt, betrayal, and despair that had woven itself into the very fabric of the community. I began to understand that the curse was not merely a product of ancient rituals gone awry, but a living embodiment of every hidden transgression, every unspoken confession, passed down like a malignant legacy. The impact of these experiences was devastating. I found myself increasingly isolated, trapped in a psychological labyrinth where the demon's whispers drowned out the voices of reason. My interactions with Claire became tinged with a growing distance, as the relentless possession left me with moments of blank detachment, gaps in memory where the demon's influence had been most potent. In those moments, I feared that I was losing not only control over my own mind but also the precious connection with the woman who had stood by me through every trial. I would return from one of these episodes to find Claire's eyes searching mine, desperate for a glimpse of the man she knew, while I struggled to piece together the fragments of my shattered self. Amid this chaos, Professor Ellis continued to be a guiding light. He visited as often as he could, his steady presence a reminder that there was a path forward, albeit one fraught with danger and uncertainty. Together, we pored over the occult texts and my increasingly erratic notes, seeking a ritual that could reconcile the demon's hold on me with the hope of breaking the curse once and for all. The proposed ritual was a convergence of everything we had uncovered, a risky, arcane ceremony that required the collective energies of Eleanor's journal, the occult texts, and the raw, unfiltered admission of every sin that had defined my existence. The ritual, Ellis warned, was not without its perils. It demanded complete surrender, a willingness to expose one's deepest, darkest secrets to the forces that lurked between life and death. The preparations for the ritual were grueling. Every symbol had to be drawn with painstaking precision, every incantation rehearsed until it resonated with the vibrations of the ancient language that had once bound the curse. I spent long hours alone in the study, the oppressive silence punctuated by the relentless tapping that had become the signature of Hollow Glen. In those hours, my guilt-ridden visions grew ever more persistent, each one a mirror reflecting the shattered fragments of my soul. I could see the faces of those I had wronged, victims of my past mistakes, and I felt their silent judgment with every beat of my heart. Claire, though burdened by her own mounting terror, took it upon herself to rally what support she could from the villagers. Yet, every attempt to forge an alliance met with closed doors and fearful glances. The community's collective denial was palpable, a deep-seated terror that prevented them from acknowledging the curse, as if admitting its presence would irrevocably shatter the fragile illusion of normalcy they clung to. Their whispers in the dim corridors of the local inn, their furtive avoidance of conversation when the subject of Hollow Glen arose, only deepened the isolation I felt. The convergence of shadows reached its apex one stormy night. The wind battered the house with a fury that seemed to shake the very foundation of reality, and the rain pounded against the windows like the relentless beating of a cursed heart. In the dim light of the study, with Professor Ellis's notes and the ancient texts spread out before me, I prepared to recite the incantations that would initiate the ritual. Claire sat beside me, her eyes full of fear and steadfast hope, her hand tightly clasping mine as if to anchor me to a world that was slipping away. As I began the incantation in the guttural tones dictated by the occult texts, the room seemed to darken, and the air grew thick with a palpable energy. I felt the weight of every secret, every regret, and every unspoken sin pressing down on me. With each syllable, the demon's presence stirred violently within me, its voice rising in a cacophonous chorus that sought to drown out my words. For a brief, terrifying moment, I felt the demon surge to the surface, its control threatening to overwhelm the fragile barrier I had built around my own consciousness. In that critical juncture, I saw visions flash before my eyes, visions of the demon's origin in Hollow Glen, of ancient settlers driven by desperation and greed, of ritual sacrifices and the birth of a curse that had now claimed me as its own. These psychic episodes were as vivid as they were horrifying, each one a brutal reminder of the dark legacy that we were entangled with. I saw the faces of those who had been lost to the curse, their eyes pleading for release, and I understood that my sacrifice might not be enough if I failed to confront the full spectrum of my own guilt. The intensity of the experience pushed me to the brink of despair. The demon's presence, seizing every opportunity to assert its dominance, forced me into moments of uncontrollable terror, a possession that left me reeling, isolated in a world where I was both the victim and the perpetrator of my own undoing. In these moments, I was acutely aware that I risked losing Claire entirely. Her comforting presence, which had anchored me in so many dark hours, began to seem distant as I slipped into the depths of psychological isolation induced by the demon's relentless intrusion. Yet, amid this inner turmoil, a spark of defiance flickered within me. With every incantation and every ritual preparation, I began to understand that the convergence of shadows was not merely an inevitable merging of our darkest fears, it was also an opportunity, a final chance to reclaim control over my destiny. The ritual, with all its peril, held the promise of purging the curse and, in doing so, breaking the vicious cycle of guilt and despair that had defined our lives in Hollow Glen. As the storm raged outside, I felt the energies in the room reach a fevered pitch. The symbols we had painstakingly drawn began to glow, casting eerie reflections on the walls. My voice, though trembling with fear, grew stronger as I continued the incantation. Claire's eyes, filled with both sorrow and unwavering resolve, met mine, and in that moment, I knew that our shared struggle had bound us together in a way that transcended the horrors we faced. The ritual demanded a complete surrender, a shedding of every layer of pretense and a raw, honest confrontation with the guilt that had haunted me for so long. In the midst of that overwhelming convergence, I felt the demon's influence wane, replaced by an indescribable clarity, a recognition that only by embracing the totality of my flawed humanity could I hope to break free from its sinister grasp. As the final words of the incantation left my lips, a deafening silence descended upon the room. For several agonizing seconds, nothing happened, only the relentless pounding of the storm outside and the quiet, steady breathing of Claire. And then, in a burst of blinding light, the symbols on the walls flared, and a powerful, almost tangible wave of energy swept over me. I felt as if every hidden sin, every whisper of regret, was being drawn from my very soul, leaving behind an emptiness that was both terrifying and liberating. When the light finally receded, I was left standing at the center of the room, physically weakened but mentally clearer than I had been in years. The demon's voice, once so overwhelming, had faded to a mere echo, a shadow of its former power. I could still feel its lingering presence, a reminder that the battle was far from over, but for the first time, I sensed that the curse was beginning to unravel. In that fragile, charged moment, as I gazed into Claire's tear-streaked face, I realized that the convergence of shadows had reached its critical turning point. I had faced the dark legacy of Hollow Glen head-on, and though the cost had been immense, I felt a cautious hope stirring within me, a hope that perhaps the demon's grip could finally be broken and that the promise of redemption was within our grasp. As the storm subsided outside and the oppressive silence of the study gave way to tentative calm, I vowed to continue the fight against the darkness that had so long plagued us. The ritual had shown me that confronting one's inner demons, however painful, was the only path to true liberation. And though I knew the demon would not vanish without a final, desperate act, in that moment I clung to the belief that together, Claire and I might yet forge a future free from the relentless shadows of our past. The storm outside raged as if nature itself sought to drown out the final confrontation that was to come. Claire's steady presence, Professor Ellis's last-minute guidance, and my own mounting resolve had led us back to the secret chamber, a place that had become the nexus of our torment and, possibly, our salvation. The air in the hidden sanctum was thick with anticipation and the residual energy of our previous rituals, as if the ancient stone itself was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. Earlier that day, Ellis had arrived one last time, his face drawn with both sorrow and a glimmer of hope. "Marcus, Claire," he had said, his voice echoing in the musty study that served as our war room, "the ritual to break the curse has only one chance. You must perform it in this chamber, where all the dark energies converge. Your inner demons, your hidden guilt, they are the fuel for this malevolent force. Only by exposing and purging them can you hope to sever the tie. But be warned, the process will be excruciating. You must be prepared to confront your darkest memories and allow yourself to be utterly vulnerable." His eyes had met mine with a mixture of compassion and stern warning before he left us to our fate. Now, as I stood before the altar once again in the secret chamber, the atmosphere was electric with raw energy. The ancient symbols carved into the stone pulsed with an unearthly light, and the shattered fragments of mirrors on the floor cast distorted reflections of our determined faces. Claire stood by my side, her hands still tightly gripping mine, her eyes locked on mine with a mixture of fear and unwavering support. The ritual, meticulously planned and painstakingly rehearsed over the past days, was about to commence. I arranged the items as instructed by Ellis, a series of small, weathered relics that had been recovered from the depths of the occult texts, and the personal tokens that symbolized my own hidden guilt, a faded photograph of the victim from that unsolved case, a small token of my lost honor, and even the antique mirror's fragment that had long been a conduit for the demonic presence. Each item was placed carefully on the stone altar in a pattern that echoed the ancient rites described in the texts. The symbols on the walls, illuminated by the flickering light, seemed to whisper secrets of ages past, urging me to finally release the burden that had weighed on my soul for so long. Claire's voice broke the oppressive silence. "Marcus, are you ready?" she asked softly, though the tremor in her tone betrayed her own fear. I could see the resolve in her eyes, an unspoken promise that, together, we would face whatever came. I nodded, swallowing hard as I prepared to recite the incantations that would bring our long-fought battle to its climax. Drawing a deep, steady breath, I began the ritual. My voice, hoarse yet resolute, filled the chamber with words in an archaic tongue, every syllable echoing off the ancient stone. With each recited phrase, I felt an overwhelming intensity building within me. The air vibrated with the sound of my own confession, and as I spoke, I could sense the demon stirring, its presence coiling around the edges of my mind like a dark, serpentine fog. In that moment, I was transported back to every painful memory I had tried to bury. I saw the anguished face of the victim, the young man whose life I had failed to protect, the one case that had defined my career and haunted my every step. The image burned into my mind with cruel clarity, and I could almost feel the weight of his silent accusation. Simultaneously, my thoughts flashed back to the moments of cowardice and betrayal that had led to my downfall, the decision to compromise the investigation, the fear that had silenced me when I should have acted, and the secret guilt that had festered for years. The demon's mocking voice surged through these memories, interweaving with the incantations. "You cannot hide," it hissed, its tone laced with contempt. "Every sin, every regret, they are the chains that bind you. Embrace them, or be consumed by them." I could feel its influence pressing on my consciousness, threatening to overwhelm me with despair. My vision blurred as the specters of my past rose before my eyes, each one a reminder of the sins I had tried to erase. In that unbearable moment of vulnerability, I realized that true strength would come not from denial but from complete and utter self-confrontation. Claire's steady hand on my arm served as a lifeline. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice trembling yet determined, "let go. Forgive yourself. You have to be free of this guilt for it to lose its hold on you." Her words were like a balm to my tortured soul, urging me to accept the truth of who I was, warts and all. With every painful word of the incantation, I forced myself to acknowledge my darkest memories, my deepest regrets. I spoke them aloud, letting the truth spill forth, an unburdening that felt both agonizing and strangely liberating. As I reached the crescendo of the ritual, the room began to tremble. The symbols on the walls flared violently, casting chaotic shadows that danced like tormented spirits. The oppressive energy in the chamber intensified to a near-tangible force. It was as if the very walls of Hollow Glen were channeling the accumulated agony of countless souls into that single, fateful moment. And then, amidst the rising tumult, the antique mirror fragment on the altar began to vibrate. Its surface, once a dull reminder of fractured reflections, shimmered with an almost blinding light. I knew what had to be done. With a final, shuddering exhalation, I snatched the mirror fragment from the altar. In that moment, I made the decision that had been crystallizing in my mind since the discovery of the chamber, to shatter the mirror entirely, to sever the demonic connection that it had long sustained. The mirror had served as a conduit, a fractured window through which the demon had invaded our lives. Destroying it, I hoped, would unleash a surge of supernatural backlash that might finally weaken its hold over us. "Marcus, no!" Claire cried out, her voice laced with both desperation and fear, but I could see in her eyes that she understood the necessity of this act. I raised the fragment high and, with a strength born of despair and defiance, brought it crashing down against the stone floor. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of shattering glass and a crack of energy that reverberated throughout the chamber. In an instant, shards of the mirror flew in every direction, each piece glinting briefly like fragments of lost hope before disappearing into darkness. A violent surge of energy erupted at that moment, and the chamber itself convulsed. The force of the explosion of supernatural power was overwhelming, a furious backlash that sent shockwaves rippling through the stone walls. I was thrown backward, my body slamming against the cold, hard floor as the demon's shrill cry echoed around me. For a heart-stopping moment, the world around us seemed to collapse in on itself, the boundaries between reality and nightmare dissolving into a maelstrom of sound and light. Claire crawled to my side as the room spun wildly, her arms enveloping me in a desperate, protective embrace. I could feel her heartbeat, rapid and frantic, as if in tune with the raging storm of energies that now threatened to consume us both. Amid the chaos, I struggled to gather my scattered senses. The room was ablaze with flickering lights, and the walls trembled as if they might crumble at any second. The overwhelming force of the backlash was both terrifying and, in its own twisted way, cathartic. It felt as though the curse itself was being torn asunder, its malignant energy dissipating in a final, violent release. When the chaos finally subsided, a heavy, eerie silence fell over the chamber. I dared to lift my head, and through blurred vision, I saw that the once mighty presence of the demon had been drastically weakened. The cacophony of mocking laughter and malevolent whispers had faded into a hollow echo, a mere murmur of what it had been. The chamber, however, bore the scars of the titanic struggle, cracks marred the ancient stone walls, and debris from the shattered mirror littered the floor. In one corner, a section of the ceiling had collapsed, nearly trapping us in a tomb of despair. Struggling to my feet, I reached out to Claire, who helped steady me as I took stock of our surroundings. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice trembling as she searched my face for any sign of the man she had known before this nightmare. I managed a weak smile, a gesture of both relief and lingering uncertainty. The demon's presence, though diminished, still lingered in the shadows, reminder that the battle was not yet won. We had broken the connection, but the curse itself, born of centuries of guilt and despair, might yet resurface if we were not vigilant. In the aftermath of the ritual, Professor Ellis arrived once more. His eyes, wide with a mix of awe and sorrow, took in the devastation around us. "It appears," he said slowly, "that the mirror was indeed the conduit of the demonic influence. By shattering it, you have severed a vital link between your inner guilt and the force that has haunted this house for so long. However, the energy unleashed by its destruction is unpredictable. The collapse of the chamber, the echoing backlash, it is all part of the curse's desperate attempt to cling to existence." His words hung in the air, heavy with the implication that while we had made significant progress, the war against the darkness was far from over. As we began the painstaking task of navigating the crumbled debris, I could sense a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The oppressive energy that had so relentlessly pressed down on us had lifted, replaced by an exhausted calm. Yet beneath that calm, a nagging dread persisted, a lingering whisper that the curse might never truly be vanquished, only momentarily subdued. That night, as Claire and I sat huddled together in the relative safety of our bedroom, I found little solace in the quiet. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch longer, and every creak in the floorboards reminded me of the darkness that still lurked just beyond our sight. The demon's diminished presence was a fragile victory, a hard-won respite that came at the cost of raw, painful exposure of my own deepest sins. In the hours that followed, I replayed every moment of the ritual in my mind, the incantations, the surge of supernatural energy, the shattering of the mirror, and the overwhelming backlash that nearly trapped us beneath crumbling stone. Each memory was a scar etched into my soul, a reminder of the price we had paid to break the curse. And yet, even as exhaustion and relief mingled within me, I felt the persistent tremor of dread, a subtle yet unyielding reminder that our battle with the darkness was far from over. Claire's gentle touch on my shoulder, as she watched me silently with those steadfast eyes, was a comfort I clung to as I drifted into a restless sleep. In my dreams, I saw fleeting images of a world bathed in pale light, a world free of the constant tapping, the mocking laughter, and the weight of unspoken guilt. But even in those brief visions of hope, I could sense an undercurrent of danger, the lingering echo of the demon's presence, a promise that the darkness might one day return to reclaim what had been stolen. In that moment of fragile triumph, as the storm of supernatural fury subsided into a tentative calm, I vowed to remain ever vigilant. The ritual had shattered a crucial link in the chain of this ancient curse, but the path ahead was still shrouded in uncertainty. With Claire by my side, and the whispered guidance of Professor Ellis echoing in my mind, I knew that the journey toward true redemption was only just beginning. Though the demon's presence had receded into the shadows, its threat lingered like a faint, persistent murmur, a reminder that in Hollow Glen, every victory was tempered by the eternal vigilance required to keep the darkness at bay. And so, as dawn broke over the ruined remnants of the secret chamber, I rose with a heart both heavy and hopeful, determined to face the future with the hard-won lessons of the past etched into my very soul. The curse, though weakened, had not been vanquished entirely. Its final dissolution would require constant, unwavering resolve, a promise to confront the darkness within and without, no matter the cost. In that moment, standing amidst the rubble of shattered secrets and fractured reflections, I understood that our battle against the curse was an unending journey. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I believed that the chains of guilt could be broken, that the demon's hold could be diminished by the light of truth and forgiveness. And with that belief, I resolved to keep fighting, to honor every sacrifice made in the depths of Hollow Glen, and to reclaim not only my own soul but the future of everyone touched by the relentless shadows of our past. In the weeks that followed the violent climax of our ritual, Hollow Glen began to settle into a deceptive calm. The oppressive, almost suffocating energy that had once dominated every creaking corridor and shadowed corner now seemed, on the surface, to have receded. The heavy silence that had hung like a shroud over our lives was replaced by an eerie quiet, one that filled each day with the promise of ordinary routines. Yet even as the house appeared to return to a semblance of normalcy, I could not shake the disquiet that had taken root within me. Each morning, as I walked the creaking floors of our home, I felt an inexplicable heaviness, a sense that beneath the polished veneer of calm lay an unresolved presence. It was as if the ritual had shattered one link in a long chain of curses but left behind another, subtler, more insidious remnant. I found myself pausing in the hallways, straining to catch a whisper, a rustle, or the fleeting echo of that demonic laughter that had once roared through the secret chamber. And in those moments, an icy shiver would creep along my spine. Claire, ever perceptive and increasingly cautious, began to voice thoughts that I had long suppressed. "Marcus," she said one gray morning as we sat over lukewarm coffee at the small kitchen table, "maybe it's time we consider leaving Hollow Glen. The house, this place, it's changed us. I see it in the way you look at every shadow, the way you're always waiting for something to happen." Her eyes, usually full of the hope and determination that had once buoyed me through our darkest hours, now held a deep, lingering sadness. I paused, considering her words. Part of me longed for escape, the desire to flee from the oppressive weight of memories and the ever-present murmur of unspoken guilt. And yet, there was something in the quiet depths of Hollow Glen that clung to me with an almost magnetic pull. It wasn't just the memories of Eleanor, or even the demonic force we had fought so desperately to contain. It was as though the house itself had become an inextricable part of my soul, a repository for secrets and sins too profound to be cast aside with a single departure. In the quiet afternoons that followed, as the late sun cast languid beams through heavy drapes, I roamed the long corridors of our home, trying to decipher the myriad clues that still lingered. It was during one of these solitary wanderings that I discovered something unexpected, a small, weathered slip of paper tucked behind a loose brick in the parlor wall. Its edges were frayed, and the ink had faded, but the message was unmistakable, fragments of text that appeared to be missing pages from Eleanor Blackwood's journal. My hands trembled as I read the cryptic lines, each word steeped in a desperate warning and an unfinished plea. Eleanor had hinted at a ritual incomplete, a last attempt to banish the curse that had doomed her. As I sat there, the slip of paper clutched in my fist, a familiar sensation prickled at the back of my neck. I turned slowly, half expecting to see a figure emerging from the shadows. Instead, I saw only the dim light flickering over old portraits and faded wallpaper. Yet the feeling persisted, an echo of something unresolved, a lingering presence that defied the illusion of tranquility. I knew then that the demon, or whatever malignant force had haunted Hollow Glen, was not yet fully vanquished. Its residue, like an indelible stain, quietly festered in the corners of our lives. That evening, Claire and I convened in the small study that had become our war room, a place littered with Professor Ellis's notes, Eleanor's journal, and the scattered relics of our previous rituals. The silence was heavy as we pored over the newly discovered pages, attempting to piece together the fragmented history that Eleanor had left behind. The words were desperate and disjointed, hinting at an ancient covenant that could not be entirely broken. Each sentence was a spectral reminder that guilt and redemption were intertwined in a way that defied easy resolution. "We thought we broke the connection, Marcus," Claire said softly, her voice barely above a whisper as she traced a trembling finger along the faded lines. "But maybe the curse was never about a single act or ritual. It's a part of this place. And maybe it's a part of us too." Her words resonated deeply within me. How could I separate my own hidden sins from the dark legacy of Hollow Glen? How could I ever claim to be free of the demons that had once controlled me? Days turned into weeks, and while the immediate supernatural assaults had ceased, the subtle signs of lingering evil began to reassert themselves in unexpected ways. I found myself waking in the dead of night to the sound of soft, almost imperceptible tapping, echoing down corridors that I had already traversed countless times. I'd catch fleeting glimpses of figures in the peripheral vision, a movement here, a shadow there, and always, that same accusatory whisper would brush past me, as if the house itself were murmuring a warning. Even the mirror in our bedroom, once shattered in our desperate ritual, seemed to harbor fractured reflections that moved independently of my own. In the quiet moments of solitude, I began to record my thoughts, my observations, and my fears in a battered notebook. Every page became a testament to the battle between light and shadow, between hope and despair. I wrote of my internal struggle, of the guilt that had once defined my every decision, of the phantom faces that now danced in my dreams, and of the lingering sense of foreboding that refused to leave me. I tried to convince myself that I had found a way to break free from the curse's clutches, but every word I wrote was haunted by the undeniable truth: some forces, once awakened, could never truly be extinguished. One crisp, unsettling morning, as I walked the quiet streets of the nearby village, I noticed that the townspeople regarded us with cautious, almost fearful glances. Their eyes, too, seemed to carry the weight of the unspoken history of Hollow Glen. Conversations were hushed when our name was mentioned, and the older residents would exchange glances laden with sorrow and resignation. In their silence, I sensed a tacit agreement, a shared belief that the curse was a shadow that extended beyond the walls of our home, a malignancy that threatened to infect all who dared to dwell in its vicinity. Despite our attempts to reintegrate with the community, a palpable distance remained between us and the villagers. Invitations to social gatherings were few and far between, and when they did occur, they were marred by an undercurrent of apprehension and pity. I began to understand that our struggle was not only personal but emblematic of a larger malaise, a community burdened by secrets and a history too dark to be spoken of openly. And as much as I wished for a return to normalcy, I knew that the curse's legacy had irrevocably altered us all. Late one night, as I sat by the flickering light of a solitary candle in our study, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound, a whisper carried on a cold breeze that seemed to drift through the walls. It was a voice that I could not quite place, familiar yet distant, as if it were echoing from a time long past. I strained to listen, my heart quickening as the sound grew more distinct, a chorus of murmurs, intermingled with a hint of sorrow and foreboding. In that moment, I realized that the demon's residue had not been banished, it lingered in the crevices of Hollow Glen, a spectral reminder that some darkness can never be fully eradicated. I found myself standing before the antique mirror in our hallway, its surface fractured and dull. As I gazed into its depths, the dim reflection of my weary face was joined by fleeting images, shadows that shifted and twisted, echoes of faces I could not identify, and the ghostly presence of Eleanor Blackwood, her eyes pleading with a silent intensity. The mirror, a silent witness to our trials, now seemed to mock me with the certainty that the past was never truly gone. In its fragmented reflection, I saw not just my own guilt, but the collective sorrow and sin of all those who had suffered beneath the curse's weight. That night, as I lay in bed beside Claire, whose gentle breathing provided the only solace in a house filled with lingering memories, I vowed to remain ever vigilant. I resolved that no matter how much the curse might recede into the background, I would never let my guard down. The echoes of our past, the unspoken sins, and the persistent presence of darkness had taught me that true redemption was not a final state, but an ongoing struggle, a daily confrontation with the demons that reside both within and without. In the ensuing days, I continued my meticulous recordings, documenting every unusual occurrence, every faint whisper, every shadow that moved against the natural order. I began to see that the battle was not solely one of banishing an external force, but of coming to terms with the inner darkness that had shaped my life. I spent hours in the study, rereading Eleanor's journal and Professor Ellis's cryptic notes, trying to find a clue, some final, elusive key that would unlock the true nature of the curse. But every line, every word, only deepened the enigma, leaving me with more questions than answers. One particularly dismal afternoon, as rain tapped incessantly against the window panes, I made a decision. I gathered the missing pages of Eleanor's journal, the ones that had been hidden in obscure corners of the house, and sat down to piece them together. The fragmented entries, written in a trembling, desperate hand, revealed hints of a final ritual, one that Eleanor had never been able to complete. They spoke of a sacrifice not of blood, but of spirit, a final act of contrition and liberation that could break the cycle of despair. Yet, as I read, I sensed that the ritual was as ambiguous as the curse itself, a last plea to forces beyond mortal control, left unfinished, like an echo waiting for its reply. In that moment, I was overcome by the realization that the curse, like our own inner darkness, might never truly be vanquished. Instead, it would linger, an ever-present shadow, a quiet murmur in the stillness of night. And perhaps that was the true nature of evil, not as an external force to be exorcised once and for all, but as an eternal companion to the human soul, a reminder that every life is touched by regret and sorrow. As the final days of our confrontation with the curse passed, Claire and I attempted to rebuild a semblance of normalcy. We resumed the mundane routines of daily life, cooking, tending the garden, even engaging in tentative conversations with the wary villagers. Yet, despite our best efforts, there was an unshakable aura of foreboding that clung to us. In every reflection, in every whispered sound of the wind, I sensed that the curse was not an isolated relic of the past but an enduring specter, bound to the sins and secrets that we all carried. Late one night, as I sat by a single, flickering candle in our now quiet living room, I felt a familiar chill sweep over me. The silence was profound, almost too complete, as if the house itself were holding its breath. And then, from somewhere deep within the walls, came a faint, sorrowful murmur, a whisper that barely stirred the air. I closed my eyes, straining to decipher its meaning, and in that moment, I understood that the curse was far from defeated. It was an echo, a lingering, pervasive presence that would forever haunt those who dared to seek redemption in a world stained by hidden sins. As dawn broke over Hollow Glen, the first rays of light filtering weakly through the time-worn windows, I stood at the threshold of the front door. The air was crisp and cold, and the quiet of the early morning was punctuated by the soft rustling of leaves and distant, indistinct voices that I could have sworn were calling my name. I felt a deep, gnawing unease, a persistent reminder that even as the sun rose, the darkness of the past lay just beneath the surface, waiting to resurface when we least expected it. In that moment of introspection, I vowed to remain ever watchful. I understood that while we had managed to shatter a vital link in the curse, the underlying evil might yet persist, a slow-burning ember in the depths of Hollow Glen. I resolved that I would not allow complacency to set in, that I would dedicate myself to the ongoing task of confronting my own inner demons, and, by extension, the dark legacy that the house represented. Claire's gentle smile, though tinged with lingering sorrow, offered a bittersweet comfort as we stepped out into the muted light of a new day. The villagers continued to regard us with cautious distance, their eyes reflecting both sympathy and an unspoken fear of the unseen forces that lurked beyond their understanding. And as we moved through the quiet streets, I couldn't help but feel that every shadow, every rustle of wind through the old trees, carried with it a hint of the darkness that had defined our journey. Now, as I write these final lines, the echo of the past still resonates in every corner of Hollow Glen. The curse remains an indelible part of our story, a specter that, though momentarily subdued, will forever linger in the spaces between light and shadow. And while I have learned to accept that some evils may never be fully eradicated, I have also discovered that the true measure of redemption lies not in the complete annihilation of darkness, but in the unyielding courage to confront it, day after day. In the quiet solitude of this moment, I vow to remain vigilant. I know that the legacy of guilt, the murmur of ancient sins, and the faint, persistent whisper of the demon's presence will continue to challenge me. Yet, I also know that every day, with Claire's unwavering support, I will continue the battle, not just against the supernatural, but against the darkness within my own soul. And so, as the light of dawn casts long, haunting shadows across the threshold of our home, I stand ready to face the future. The curse of Hollow Glen, with all its enigmatic, lingering echoes, will forever be a part of our lives, a reminder that evil, once awakened, leaves behind a trail of secrets and sorrow that can never be entirely forgotten. But in that enduring vigilance lies a quiet, defiant hope, that by confronting the darkness in all its forms, we might someday transform our haunted past into a future defined not by fear, but by the unyielding light of truth and redemption. In the end, as I close this chapter of our journey, I do so with a heart both heavy and hopeful, a heart that understands that while some shadows may never fully vanish, it is our eternal struggle against them that defines us. And in that struggle, perhaps, lies the true essence of what it means to be human.